The sky over Konoha was still the wrong color. 3 days after Pain's assault, smoke no longer rose from the craters where buildings used to stand, but the air still carried that burnt, mineral smell that gets into your clothes and doesn't leave. If you'd walked through the village that morning, you would have seen shinobi in dust-covered flak jackets hauling broken support beams out of collapsed homes, medics moving in tired, efficient lines between makeshift shelters, and civilians standing in the wreckage of their front doors, just staring, like they were waiting for the houses to rebuild themselves out of sheer disbelief. And in the middle of all of it, standing on the lip of a crater nearly 200 meters wide, was Naruto Uzumaki. He wasn't moving. He'd been standing there for almost 20 minutes, hands shoved into his pockets, staring down into the pit where the center of his village used to be. The Hokage monument was cracked. The academy where he'd once failed the graduation exam 3 times was a pile of splintered wood. And somewhere under all of this rubble, people he knew, people who had cheered his name only hours before, had been buried, wounded, or worse. You know that feeling when something happens that's so big you can't process it in real time? When your brain just keeps replaying the moment, over and over, looking for the part where it makes sense? That was Naruto right now. He'd beaten Pain. He'd saved the village. The whole world knew that by now, and by tomorrow the whole elemental nations probably would too. But standing here, looking at the damage, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a bill that had already been paid in full, whether he liked the price or not. You've been standing there a while. Naruto didn't turn around. He recognized the voice, low, dry, unmistakably done with pleasantries. Shikamaru Nara stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets too, surveying the crater with the same flat, calculating stare he gave every problem, personal tragedy included. Just thinking, Naruto said. That's a first, Shikamaru muttered, but there was no bite in it. Not today. They stood there together for a moment, 2 shinobi who'd both lost people, staring into a hole where a village used to be whole. You ever think about how close that was? Naruto finally asked. Like, actually think about it. If Pain had kept going, if I hadn't, he stopped himself before he said something dramatic, something that sounded too much like bragging about a fight he still had nightmares about. If things had gone differently. Shikamaru exhaled through his nose, a sound that in Nara speak meant yes, obviously, and I've already run the numbers 11 different ways. I think about it every time I walk past the Genin team, Shikamaru said. 4-person cells. A Jonin sensei who's lucky if they've got a B rank under their belt. That's what we send out to handle problems most of the time. Works fine for bandits, rogue chunin, the occasional missing nin. He nodded toward the crater. It does not work for that. No, Naruto agreed quietly. It doesn't. That was the thought that had been sitting in Naruto's chest since the moment the dust settled. Heavier, honestly, than the grief. Konoha had an ANBU division, sure. Elite operatives, black ops, the works. But ANBU answered up a chain that ran straight through Danzo's fingers half the time, tangled with Root's shadow operations in ways that made even Tsunade uneasy. And the rest of the village's defense ran on Genin teams and Jonin senseis who trained for missions, not apocalypses. Akatsuki wasn't done. Everyone knew that. Pain had been one member. There were still others out there, each one, if the intelligence reports were even half right, potentially strong enough to do what Pain had just done, or worse. And Konoha's answer to that threat was still built for stopping bandit raids. If you were the one standing in that crater, staring at the wreckage of everything you'd grown up around, what would you do next? Rebuild the same system and hope it holds? Or build something new? Naruto had already made up his mind. He just needed to convince someone with the authority to actually let him do it. The Hokage's temporary office was a tent. Not a metaphor, an actual canvas tent, staked into the dirt on the outskirts of what used to be the administrative district, because the real building was rubble like everything else. Tsunade sat behind a folding table that had clearly been someone's kitchen table in another life, surrounded by stacks of hastily reorganized mission scrolls and a half-drunk cup of green tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She looked exhausted. Not just tired, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 days pouring every ounce of her own chakra into keeping half the village's survivors breathing, on top of everything else a Hokage had to manage in the middle of a crisis. Shizen stood beside her, arms full of reports, looking barely better off. Naruto, Tsunade said without looking up from the scroll in front of her. If this is about getting Sakura extra medical shifts, the answer is she already volunteered before you could ask. It's not about that. Naruto stepped fully into the tent, letting the flap fall shut behind him. Shizen raised an eyebrow at the seriousness in his tone. This wasn't the usual barging in, loud-mouthed Naruto energy. This was something else. Tsunade finally looked up. Whatever she saw on his face made her set the scroll down. All right, she said. You've got my attention. Talk. Naruto took a breath. He'd rehearsed this in his head about 6 different ways walking over here, and every version sounded either too aggressive or too much like he was asking for a favor instead of proposing something the village actually needed. So he just went with the truth. We almost lost everything 3 days ago, he said. Not because our shinobi weren't strong. Not because you weren't strong, Bachan. You went toe-to-toe with pain and kept this whole village breathing. But because the system wasn't built to handle something like this. We've got genin cells for small missions and jonin for bigger ones and ANBU buried somewhere in between, half of it tangled up with Danzo and Root doing whatever they want in the dark. There's nothing, built specifically to handle threats on the level of Akatsuki. And Akatsuki isn't done. You know that better than anyone. Tsunade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at Danzo's name, but she didn't interrupt. So I want to build something, Naruto continued. A unit. Small, 5, 6 people, hand-picked, not assigned by whoever's next on a rotation list. People who can move fast, hit hard, and handle threats before they turn into another crater in the middle of the village. And it reports straight to you. Not to the council. Not anywhere near Root. Just you. The tent went quiet except for the distant sound of hammers and shouted instructions from the rebuilding efforts outside. Shizen looked between Naruto and Tsunade like she wasn't sure whether to be impressed or alarmed. Probably some of both. Tsunade leaned back in her chair, studying Naruto with the kind of look she usually reserved for reading a patient's chart, assessing, weighing, trying to see past the surface presentation to what was actually going on underneath. You're describing ANBU, she said finally. That already exists. ANBU that Danzo had his hands all over for years. Naruto shot back, more heat in his voice than he meant to let out. You know that. Everyone who's paid attention knows that. I'm not saying scrap the whole division. I'm saying Konoha needs something that isn't compromised. Something that isn't going to end up being used for whatever Danzo decides is necessary this week. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you already know Naruto and Danzo don't exactly see eye to eye. And this moment, right here, is where that tension stops simmering and starts boiling. Tsunade was quiet for a long moment. She rubbed at her temple, and for just a second, the exhaustion on her face deepened into something closer to old, tired grief. The kind that came from decades of watching Konoha's shadow institutions do exactly the kind of thing Naruto was describing, and knowing there wasn't always a clean way to stop it. You're not wrong, she admitted quietly. About any of it. Naruto blinked. He'd expected pushback, at minimum a lecture about chain of command and how a 17-year-old genin, technically still genin, if you wanted to get technical about rank, though nobody in the village really thought of him that way anymore, didn't get to propose restructuring the village's defense apparatus on a whim. But Tsunade continued, holding up a hand before he could get too hopeful. You're also talking about creating an off-the-books unit answerable only to the Hokage during a period when this village has never been more politically fragile. The council is going to be crawling all over every decision I make for the next several months, trying to claw back authority they think I've mismanaged. If I greenlight something like this without airtight justification, it doesn't just put a target on your back. It puts one on mine. So don't call it ANBU, Naruto said immediately. Don't call it anything official yet. Let me prove it works first. Give me, I don't know, a probation period. A month. Let me pick the team. Let me show you what we can actually do, and if it doesn't work, you shut it down and nobody outside this tent ever has to know it existed. Shizen shifted the stack of reports in her arms. Lady Tsunade, if I may. You may not, Tsunade said, but without any real bite, more out of habit than irritation. She was still looking at Naruto, weighing something behind her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Finally, she exhaled, Long, slow, the sound of someone deciding to take a risk she probably shouldn't. 1 month, she said. You get a probationary charter. No official designation, no ANBU mask, nothing that shows up on the books beyond a training exercise authorization that I sign personally. You pick your team, but I want to approve every name before you approach them, because the last thing I need is you recruiting someone mid-mission for another squad and causing a diplomatic incident with Kurenai over stolen personnel. Deal, Naruto said too fast, grinning despite the exhaustion pressing down on the whole tent. I'm not finished. Tsunade's voice sharpened, Hokage mode fully engaged now. This unit does not exist to settle scores. It does not exist to go picking fights with Root, no matter how much you'd probably enjoy that. Its purpose is defense, rapid response to threats this village currently has no adequate answer for. If I find out you've used this charter as an excuse to go digging into Danzo's business out of some personal vendetta, I will shut this down myself, and you will not get a second chance. Are we clear? Naruto's jaw tightened, because if he was being honest with himself, part of him, a pretty large part, absolutely did want an excuse to dig into whatever Danzo had been hiding all these years. But he nodded anyway. Clear. Good. Tsunade reached for a blank scroll and began writing, her handwriting quick and efficient despite the fatigue clearly weighing on her. 1 month. You report to me directly, every week, in person, no exceptions. If this village so much as sneezes wrong, I want to know you and your team are capable of handling it before the sneeze turns into another crater. She rolled the scroll, sealed it with a quick chakra-infused stamp, and held it out. Naruto took it like it was something precious. Which, in a way, it was. Thank you, Bachan, he said, and for once there wasn't a trace of his usual joking tone in it. Tsunade's expression softened, just slightly, the Hokage mask cracking to let a little bit of the woman underneath show through. Don't thank me yet, brat. Thank me if you actually manage to build something that survives contact with reality. A lot of good ideas look great in a tent and fall apart the second real pressure hits them. And if you've watched enough of these What If series with me, you already know, that's basically a promise things are about to get complicated. Naruto walked out of that tent with the scroll clutched in one hand and a strange mix of adrenaline and dread churning in his stomach. He had a month to prove that this wasn't just some impulsive idea born out of grief and anger at a smoking crater, that it was something real, something Konoha actually needed. The problem was, ideas are easy. People are hard. He needed a team. Not a random assortment of strong shinobi thrown together. He'd learned enough from watching Kakashi lead Team 7, and from watching how badly things could go when people didn't trust each other in a fight, to know that raw strength wasn't the priority here. He needed people who could think fast, adapt faster, and who, more than anything, the village had underestimated or overlooked. People with something to prove. People like him. He already had a mental list forming. He just didn't know yet how hard it would be to convince some of them. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the ruined skyline and cast long orange shadows across the rebuilding efforts still going on below, Naruto found himself back at the edge of that same crater. He wasn't sure why he kept coming back to it. Maybe it was easier to think clearly here, in the place where everything had almost ended, than anywhere else in the half-rebuilt village. He heard footsteps behind him. Light, controlled, unmistakably shinobi, and didn't need to turn around to know who it was. You've been avoiding the hospital, Sakura said, coming to stand beside him. She had bandages wrapped around both forearms, faint chakra burns from 3 straight days of healing work visible at the edges. Everyone's been asking where you disappeared to. I needed some air, Naruto said. Which wasn't exactly a lie. Sakura studied him for a moment, the way she always did when she suspected he was hiding something. Half medic-neen diagnostic stare, half years of friendship reading him like an open book. What's in the scroll? She asked, nodding toward the sealed document still clutched in his hand. Naruto hesitated. He hadn't planned on telling anyone yet, not until he had more of the pieces in place. But this was Sakura. If there was anyone in the village he trusted completely with something like this, it was her. So he told her. All of it. The crater, the conversation with Tsunade, the probationary charter, the idea of a small, elite unit built to handle threats the village currently had no answer for. By the time he finished, Sakura's expression had shifted from confusion to something more complicated. Pride, worry, and just a little bit of course you did this exasperation, all tangled together. You're serious, she said finally. Dead serious. Naruto, this is… She stopped, pressed her lips together, clearly choosing her words carefully. This is a big deal. You know that, right? You're not just proposing a new mission format. You're proposing something that's going to step directly on Root's territory, whether you frame it that way or not. Danzo is not going to sit quietly and let you build an independent Black Ops unit right under his nose. I know, Naruto said quietly. I thought about that. I thought about it a lot, actually. And… He looked back out at the crater, at the long shadows stretching across broken stone and half-rebuilt walls. And I decided I don't care, he said. Sakura, if something like pain happens again, if Akatsuki sends someone else, someone even stronger, and we've still got nothing built to handle it except genin teams and whatever Danzo decides to authorize from the shadows, how many more of these are we going to end up standing in front of? He gestured at the crater. I'm not doing this to make a name for myself. I'm doing it because somebody has to, and I already have Bachan's charter in my hand. Sakura was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. Okay, she said. Then don't do it half-measured. If you're building a team, build it right. Who do you have in mind? Naruto managed a small, tired smile, the first real one since the crater had appeared 3 days ago. That's the part one haven't figured out yet. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is all about exploring what-if scenarios in the Naruto universe, and I promise you, this one's going to get good. If you don't want to miss where this squad ends up, now's a great time to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because things are about to get a lot more complicated. What Naruto didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, standing there at the edge of that crater with Sakura beside him and a hastily signed charter in his hand, was that Tsunade's tent wasn't as private as it felt. Word travels fast in a village built on information, and it travels faster still when the person collecting it has spent decades perfecting the art of hearing things he was never meant to hear. In a windowless room somewhere beneath what remained of Konoha's administrative sector, one of the few structures that had survived Pain's assault almost entirely intact, because it had never officially existed on any blueprint the AIM Shinobi could have targeted, Danzo Shimura sat in near total darkness, a single candle burning low on the table in front of him. Across from him stood a masked figure, one of dozens who answered to him and him alone, who had just finished relaying, word for word, everything that had been said inside the Hokage's tent that afternoon. Danzo's remaining visible eye narrowed slightly. His expression, as always, gave away almost nothing, but the fingers of his bandaged hand, resting on the table's edge, tightened just fractionally. An independent unit, he said slowly, testing the words like a man checking for rot in a beam before deciding whether the structure could still be trusted. Answerable only to the Hokage. Built specifically to operate outside our purview. Yes, Danzo-sama, the masked operative confirmed. The boy secured a probationary charter. 1 month. He intends to begin recruitment immediately. For a long moment, Danzo said nothing at all. The candle flame flickered, throwing shifting shadows across the room's bare stone walls. He had built Root over decades, a shadow beneath the village's skin, invisible to nearly everyone, answerable to no council, no committee, nothing but his own judgment of what Konoha needed to survive in a world that did not reward mercy or hesitation. He had watched Hokage after Hokage make decisions he considered soft, sentimental, dangerously naive, and he had quietly built the apparatus necessary to correct those mistakes when they threatened the village's survival. And now the Uzumaki boy, the very embodiment, in Danzo's eyes, of the sentimental, undisciplined approach to shinobi strength that he had spent his life working against, was proposing to build something that would exist entirely outside his control. Something with the Hokage's direct blessing. Something that, if it succeeded, might expose exactly the kind of operations Danzo had spent decades keeping buried. He is more perceptive than I credited him for, Danzo said finally, and there was something almost like respect buried beneath the cold calculation in his voice. The kind of respect one predator has for another that has, for the first time, become a genuine threat rather than simply prey. Or perhaps simply reckless enough to stumble into the correct conclusion by accident. Either way, this cannot be permitted to proceed unchecked. Your orders, Danzo-sama? Danzo was quiet for another long moment, thinking. He did not believe in rash action. Every move he made was calculated 3 steps ahead, weighed against a dozen possible outcomes before it was ever set into motion. A direct confrontation now, while Tsunade's authority, however weakened, still carried the full weight of her office in the wake of the village's near destruction, would be premature. Foolish, even. The council was already watching him closely enough as it was. No. Better to watch. To gather information. To understand exactly who the boy intended to recruit, what strengths and weaknesses this fledgling unit would possess, before deciding how, and when, to act. We watch, Danzo said finally. Quietly. I want to know every name he approaches, every candidate he considers, before he even finishes making his selections. If this unit is to exist within our village, I intend to understand precisely what it is capable of long before the boy does. The masked operative bowed once, silently, and disappeared into the shadows of the room as though he had never been there at all. Danzo remained seated a moment longer, staring at the candle flame, his mind already turning through possibilities the way it always did, patient, methodical, 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Let the boy build his little team, he thought. Let him believe, for now, that he is operating in secret. Every piece on the board reveals something about the player who moves it, and I have never yet met a piece I could not eventually turn to my own purposes. Meanwhile, unaware that his fledgling project had already drawn the attention of the most dangerous man currently operating within Konoha's walls, Naruto sat cross-legged on the roof of his apartment building that night, the scroll from Tsunade unrolled across his knees, a stub of pencil in hand, and a growing list of names scrawled beside it. The stars above the village were clearer than usual, no smoke left to blur them, at least, even if the ground below was still scarred and broken. Naruto stared up at them for a while, thinking about everything that had happened over the past 3 days. Pain. Jiraiya's death, still an open wound he hadn't fully let himself feel yet. The crater. The tent. The charter now sitting on his lap like a promise he intended to keep. If you're building a team meant to protect people the way you were never protected, he thought, who do you even start with? He thought about Hinata first, not because it was the obvious choice, but because it wasn't. Everyone in the village still thought of her as the shy, hesitant heiress who never quite lived up to the Hyuga name, when in reality Naruto had seen her stand between him and pain without a second's hesitation, willing to die rather than let him fall. That wasn't hesitation. That was quiet, unshakable strength that the village had simply never bothered to look at closely enough to notice. He thought about Shikamaru next, still mourning Asuma but sharper than ever because of it, already thinking 6 steps ahead of everyone else in every conversation Naruto had had with him over the past 3 days. He thought about Sai, and that one gave him pause, because Sai was still, as far as anyone knew, tied to Root, and recruiting him meant walking directly into whatever tangled loyalty Danzo still held over him. But Naruto had seen something inside during their mission to retrieve Sasuke, a flicker of something underneath the blank-painted smile, something that wanted badly to understand what it meant to actually care about people instead of simply being ordered to protect them. If that flicker was real, Sai might be exactly the kind of person this team needed. If it wasn't, well, that was a risk Naruto would have to weigh carefully. And he thought about Yamato, steady, experienced, actual ANBU training under his belt, someone who could keep a team like this from falling apart the first time things got difficult, and who Naruto trusted more than almost anyone else in the village not named Kakashi or Sakura. 4 names. A start. Naruto set the pencil down and looked back up at the stars, feeling the full, staggering weight of what he was about to attempt settle onto his shoulders. A month. 4 names, maybe 5, maybe 6 if things went well. A charter that existed on paper but nowhere else. And somewhere out there, unknown to him, a war beginning to take shape that he wouldn't fully understand the scope of for weeks yet. You know that feeling right before you jump off something really high, that half second where your whole body is screaming that this is a terrible idea, right before you actually jump anyway? That was exactly how Naruto felt, sitting on that rooftop with a half-finished list of names and an entire village's future resting, in some small but very real way, on whether he could pull this off. He rolled up the scroll, tucked it carefully into his jacket, and allowed himself, for the first time in 3 exhausting days, a genuine smile. Tomorrow, he'd start recruiting. Tomorrow, everything would begin. The morning after Naruto sat on his rooftop turning names over in his head like stones in his pocket, he woke up before dawn for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not because of nightmares, though those had been a fixture ever since Pain's attack, and probably would be for a while longer. He woke up because his mind had kept working through the night even while the rest of him slept, and by the time the sky outside his window started turning that pale, undecided gray that comes right before sunrise, he already had a plan. 4 names. Hinata, Shikamaru, Sai, Yamato. If you're going to build something that's supposed to protect people the village overlooked, you don't start by picking the people everyone already respects. You start with the people nobody bothered to really see. That was the thought driving him as he pulled on his jacket and headed out into the half-rebuilt streets of Konoha, past work crews already hammering fresh support beams into place, past civilians sorting through salvaged belongings in makeshift camps that had sprung up on the village's undamaged eastern side. 3 days after the crater, and already the place was fighting to put itself back together. It made something in Naruto's chest tighten every time he saw it. Pride and grief tangled up so close together he couldn't always tell which one he was actually feeling. He had a scroll in his jacket with the Hokage's seal on it, and a month to prove an idea. He wasn't going to waste a single day of it. Finding Hinata turned out to be easier than he expected, and talking to her turned out to be exactly as hard as he'd feared. She was at the Hyuga compound's private training grounds, alone, running through a kata under the pale early light, slow, deliberate movements, each strike landing with a precision that looked almost gentle, until you noticed the way the air seemed to ripple where her palms passed through it. Naruto had seen the gentle fist style plenty of times, mostly from Neji, but there was something different about watching Hinata practice it alone, unobserved, without the weight of anyone's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She noticed him before he'd even fully stepped through the compound gate. Of course she did. Byakugan users didn't miss much, and her whole form seemed to straighten, some of the fluid confidence from a moment ago replaced by the more familiar, careful posture she wore around most people. And Naruto-kun, she said, lowering her hands. A faint flush crept up from her collar, though she'd mostly gotten past the days when just his presence would send her stammering into silence. Mostly. What are you doing here? Hey, Hinata. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware that he hadn't actually rehearsed this conversation nearly as much as he should have. Got a minute? I wanted to ask you something. It's kind of a big deal, actually. Something in his tone must have registered, because the careful, polite mask she usually wore around him shifted into genuine attentiveness. Of course, she said, stepping closer, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She was dressed, as always, in her practical training clothes, a high-collared jacket layered over long sleeves, loose enough to move freely in but modest all the same, the Hyuga crest stitched discreetly over her heart. Is everything all right? Yeah, I mean, no, not really, but not like that. Naruto exhaled, forcing himself to just say it the way he'd said it to Sakura the night before, without dressing it up. You know how close we came to losing everything 3 days ago. And you know Akatsuki isn't finished. There's still more of them out there, probably stronger than Pain in some cases. I don't think the village has anything built to actually handle that. Genin teams, Jonin missions, even ANBU the way it currently runs, none of it's really built for the kind of threat we're facing now. Hinata listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with every word, the faint blush from a moment ago entirely forgotten. So I asked Tsunade if I could put together a unit, Naruto continued. Small. Elite. People who can move fast and handle threats before they turn into another crater. It reports straight to her, not the council, not anywhere near Root. She gave me a month to prove it works. He met Hinata's pale, unblinking eyes directly. And I want you on it. For a long moment, Hinata said nothing at all. Naruto watched something complicated pass across her face, surprise first, quick and genuine, followed by something that looked almost like disbelief. Me? She said finally, quietly. Yeah, you. Naruto took a half-step closer, earnest in a way that made Hinata's breath catch just slightly. Hinata, I watched you stand between me and pain without even hesitating. You were willing to die to protect me. That's not nothing. That's exactly the kind of person I need on this team. Someone who doesn't just have the skill, but has the heart for it, you know? And your Byakugan alone is worth more than half the intel gathering ANBU's ever managed to pull off. Hinata's fingers curled slightly at her sides, and Naruto could see her visibly working to steady herself, the way she always did when emotion threatened to overwhelm her composure. She started, then stopped, swallowing. I always thought, everyone in my family always said I wasn't strong enough. Not compared to Niji, not compared to what a Hyuga heir is supposed to be. I never thought anyone would. She cut herself off again, cheeks coloring, and looked down at her hands. That's exactly why I'm asking you, Naruto said gently. Because everyone else has spent your whole life telling you what you're not. I've seen what you actually are. And I think this team needs that. You know that moment in every story where someone finally hears the thing they've been waiting their whole life to hear, and it's almost too much to process all at once? Yeah, that's exactly where Hinata is right now. Hinata was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands, and when she finally looked back up at him, there were tears standing at the corners of her eyes that she was visibly fighting not to let fall. Yes, she said, voice barely above a whisper, but steady all the same. I'll join. Whatever you need me to do, I'm in. Naruto grinned, the wide, genuine grin that had a way of making even exhausted, grieving people around him feel just a little bit lighter. Awesome, he said. Seriously, thank you, Hinata. This means a lot. She managed a small, shy smile in return, still visibly overwhelmed but steadier now, some new resolve settling into her shoulders that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Neither of them noticed the faint shimmer of chakra-suppressed presence perched in the branches of a tree overlooking the training grounds, a root operative, motionless, cataloging every word of the conversation with the same clinical detachment he applied to every assignment Danzo gave him. By the time the sun had fully risen over Konoha, the first name on Naruto's list had already been reported back to a windowless room beneath the village's administrative sector. Shikamaru was harder. Naruto found him exactly where he expected to, lying flat on his back on a grassy hill overlooking the Nara clan's deer pasture, watching clouds that had finally returned to a sky no longer choked with smoke. It should have been a peaceful image. Instead, there was something hollow about it, a stillness that had nothing to do with Shikamaru's usual laziness, and everything to do with grief he hadn't fully worked through yet. You're blocking my view, Shikamaru said without opening his eyes, the moment Naruto's shadow fell across him. Didn't realize clouds needed an unobstructed sight line, Naruto shot back, dropping down to sit cross-legged beside him anyway. Shikamaru cracked one eye open, studying Naruto with the kind of lazy scrutiny that somehow always managed to see more than people expected. You've got that look again, he said. The one from yesterday. What is it this time? Naruto didn't waste time dancing around it, not with Shikamaru, who'd see through any attempt at subtlety in about 4 seconds anyway. He laid it all out, same as he had with Hinata, the crater, Tsunade, the charter, the idea of a small, elite unit built to actually handle threats on Akatsuki's level. Shikamaru sat up slowly as Naruto talked, his usual half-lidded, bored expression sharpening into something more focused, more alert. And you want me on it, Shikamaru said when Naruto finished. It wasn't really a question. Yeah. Your tactical thinking's the best in the village, Shikamaru. You already proved that against the Sound Four, against Haiden and Kakuzu. You think in ways nobody else does. I need someone who can actually plan this stuff out instead of just charging in like an idiot. Which, let's be clear, is normally your entire strategy, Shikamaru said dryly, but there was no real heat in it. Yeah, well, that's why I need you. Naruto grinned, but it faded when he saw Shikamaru's expression shift, something heavier settling behind his eyes. I don't know, Naruto, Shikamaru said slowly, looking back up at the clouds. After Asuma-sensei, he stopped, jaw tightening. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to lead people into danger. Every decision I make, I keep running the numbers on how it could get someone killed. It's exhausting. And you're asking me to be part of a unit that's specifically built to walk directly into the kind of threats that killed him. Naruto was quiet for a moment, letting that sit between them instead of rushing to fill the silence. I get it, he said finally. I really do. But Shikamaru, think about it this way. If we'd had something like this 3 days ago, something built specifically to handle a threat like pain before it ever reached the village gates, how many people would still be alive? How many people wouldn't have had to fight and die in a battle that shouldn't have had to happen at all? Shikamaru's jaw worked silently for a moment. That's not fair, he muttered. No, Naruto agreed. It's not. But it's true. They sat in silence for a while, watching clouds drift lazily across a sky finally clear of smoke. Naruto didn't push further. He'd learned, somewhere along the way, that Shikamaru needed space to actually think things through rather than being pressured into a decision. Pushing too hard usually just made him dig in stubbornly the other direction. Asuma-sensei used to say something, Shikamaru said finally, quietly, still looking up at the sky, about how the king piece in shogi is the weakest piece on the board, but it's the one everything else exists to protect. He said being a good shogi player means understanding that protecting what matters is worth more than any individual piece you might lose along the way. He exhaled slowly. I think he'd have wanted me to actually use what he taught me for something like this. Instead of just sitting on a hill, watching clouds, being afraid of losing anyone else. So you're in? Naruto asked, careful to keep the hope out of his voice, not wanting to pressure him further. Shikamaru was quiet for another long moment. Then, finally, he nodded, exhaling a long breath that seemed to carry some of the weight off his shoulders even as he spoke. Yeah, he said. I'm in. Someone's got to keep you from getting yourself killed doing something reckless, anyway. Ha! That's more like it. Naruto's grin returned in full force, and even Shikamaru managed a small, tired smile in response. 2 down. And if you thought that conversation was heavy, just wait. Naruto's next stop is about to be a whole lot more complicated. Naruto found Yamato at the training grounds near the Forest of Death's outer perimeter, running solo exercises with his wood style. Great pillars of living wood rising and collapsing back into the earth in smooth, controlled sequences. The kind of casual mastery that only came from years of ANBU-level discipline. Naruto, Yamato said, not even breaking his rhythm as a final wooden pillar sank back into the soil. I heard you had an interesting conversation with the Hokage yesterday. Naruto blinked. How do you already know about that? Yamato's expression flickered with something like amusement. I have my sources. Also, Shizen mentioned it in passing, and word travels fast among people who used to work directly under the Hokage's office. He turned to face Naruto fully, wiping a bit of dirt from his hands. An independent unit HM? Reporting directly to Tsunade-sama, operating outside the standard ANBU chain of command? You make it sound complicated when you say it like that, Naruto said. It is complicated, Yamato replied evenly. Which is exactly why I'm guessing you're here to ask me to help make it slightly less complicated. Naruto laughed despite himself. Yeah, basically. I need someone with actual ANBU experience. Someone who knows how Black Ops units are actually supposed to function, who can help train the rest of us and keep things from falling apart. You're literally the only person I trust for that job. Yamato considered him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Naruto had always found Yamato a little hard to read, calm, controlled, with a steadiness that came from years of operating in the shadows under Danzo's old command structure before eventually being reassigned to watch over Team 7. There was history there Naruto didn't fully understand, old wounds from his time as one of Orochimaru's experimental subjects that he rarely talked about, but Naruto had never doubted, not once, that Yamato genuinely cared about protecting the people under his charge. You understand what you're asking, Yamato said finally. This isn't like training a genin cell. If we're building something meant to actually handle Akatsuki-level threats, the training needs to be brutal, realistic. People could get hurt in the process, and worse, in the field. I know, Naruto said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was agreeing to. That's exactly why I need someone who's actually done this before, instead of just improvising and hoping for the best. Yamato studied him for another long moment, and then, slowly, nodded. All right, he said. I'm in. Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed proving a point, after all. That's basically what Shikamaru said, Naruto said, grinning. Then Shikamaru's a smart man, Yamato said dryly. Speaking of which, has he already agreed to join? Yeah. He's in. And Hinata too. Yamato's expression shifted slightly, something more thoughtful crossing his face. A solid start. But if you're building a unit meant to handle serious threats, 4 people, 5 counting yourself, might not be quite enough, depending on the scope of what you're facing. Have you considered who else might round out the team? Naruto hesitated. This was the part he'd been dreading bringing up, even to Yamato, maybe especially to Yamato, given everything Yamato himself had once been tangled up in. I was thinking about Sai, he admitted finally. Yamato went very still. Sai, he repeated slowly. Yeah. I know it's complicated given everything. But I saw something in him during the mission to bring back Sasuke. Something underneath all the training Danzo drilled into him. I think if he had a real chance to be part of something that actually cared about him as a person instead of just using him as a tool, he could become someone completely different from who Root tried to make him. Yamato was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. Naruto knew, in a general sense, that Yamato had once operated under conditions not entirely dissimilar to Sai's, trained under Orochimaru's brutal experimentation, shaped into a weapon before he'd ever really had the chance to become a person first. If anyone in the village understood what it might take to help someone like Sai actually break free of that conditioning, it was probably Yamato. It's a risk, Yamato said finally. Sai's loyalty to Root runs deep, deeper probably, than even he fully understands himself. Danzo doesn't just train operatives. He conditions them, psychologically, from a very young age, in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to fully undo. He paused. But I understand the impulse, and for what it's worth, I don't disagree with your read on him. I've seen glimpses of the same thing you have. So you think it's worth trying? Yamato exhaled slowly. I think, he said carefully, that if anyone stands a chance of reaching whatever's still human underneath Sai's root conditioning, it's probably you. But Naruto, if you approach him directly, Danzo will know within the hour. You need to think carefully about how you handle this. Naruto nodded slowly, turning the problem over in his mind. Yamato was right. If he was going to bring Sai into this, he needed to be smart about it, not just charge in the way he usually did. Would you talk to him first? Naruto asked finally. You understand this stuff a lot better than I do. Maybe if it came from you instead of me, he'd actually consider it seriously instead of just reporting straight back to Root. Yamato considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can approach him. Carefully. But Naruto, understand that whatever happens, this is likely to draw Danzo's direct attention to your unit far sooner than you might want. Root does not take kindly to losing assets it considers its own. I figured that was probably coming eventually anyway, Naruto said, his voice steady despite the weight of what Yamato was describing. Might as well happen now, while we've still got a full month to prove ourselves before anyone official has to know we exist. And there it is. The moment Naruto's little probationary project stops being a quiet, under-the-radar idea and starts becoming something that's going to draw some very dangerous attention. If you're enjoying this story so far, now's a great time to hit that subscribe button, because things are about to get a whole lot more tense. Yamato found Sai exactly where he expected to, alone, as always, in a quiet corner of the village's undamaged eastern district, sitting cross-legged in front of a small canvas, ink brush moving in slow, deliberate strokes across the paper. Sai had always preferred painting alone, away from the noise and chaos of other people, ever since Yamato had first been assigned to oversee Team 7 in Kakashi's absence. That's a peaceful scene, Yamato observed, studying the painting over Sai's shoulder. A simple landscape, mountains and a quiet lake, rendered with the same technical precision Sai brought to everything he did, though something in the brushstrokes felt different from the emotionless, mechanically perfect work Yamato remembered from Sai's early days on the team. There was something almost like warmth in it now, subtle but undeniably present. I find it calming, Sai said, not looking up from his work, his expression as carefully neutral as ever, though the painted-on smile he'd worn during his first weeks with Team 7 had long since faded into something more genuine, if still guarded. Ugly emotions have been difficult to process since the attack. Painting helps. Understandable, Yamato said, settling down beside him. It's been a difficult few days for everyone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sai's brush moving steadily across the canvas, before Yamato finally spoke again. I wanted to talk to you about something, he said carefully. Naruto's putting together a new unit. Small elite, reporting directly to the Hokage, built to handle threats the village currently doesn't have an adequate response for. He asked me to be part of it. And he'd like you to consider joining as well. Sai's brush paused, just slightly, over the canvas. Me, he said, his tone giving away almost nothing. You, Yamato confirmed. He believes you have valuable skills to offer. And if I'm being honest, I think he's right. Sai was quiet for a long moment, setting his brush down carefully beside the canvas, folding his hands in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful in a way that Yamato recognized immediately as years of root conditioning working to suppress whatever genuine reaction might be trying to surface underneath. Danzo-sama assigned me to Team 7 for a specific purpose, Sai said slowly. To monitor Sasuke Uchiha, and to eliminate him should the situation require it. That mission has technically concluded, in the sense that Sasuke has left the village and remains beyond our reach for now. I have not received new orders regarding my next assignment, which means, Yamato said gently, that you currently have an opportunity most people in Root's position never get. A choice. Sai's expression flickered, something complicated passing behind his dark eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Root operatives do not typically get to make choices, Sai said quietly. We are given purpose. Given orders. It is simpler that way. Cleaner. Is it though? Yamato asked, keeping his voice gentle, non-confrontational. Or is it just what you were taught to believe, because believing anything else was dangerous? Sai was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his folded hands. I have been trying, he said finally, so quietly Yamato almost missed it, to understand what Naruto and the others mean, when they talk about bonds. About caring for people beyond what use they provide. I read a book about it, once, about how friendship and connection are supposed to feel. But reading about something and actually experiencing it are different things, I've come to understand. They are, Yamato agreed softly. And I think, whether you fully realize it yet or not, you've already started experiencing some of that. On Team 7. With Naruto, and Sakura, and even Kakashi, that's not something root conditioning can be blamed for. That's something real, that belongs entirely to you. Sai didn't respond immediately, his dark eyes fixed on the half-finished painting in front of him, the quiet mountains, the still lake, something in the composition that felt, Yamato realized suddenly, less like a landscape and more like a memory of somewhere Sai wished he could actually go. If I join this unit, Sai said finally, slowly, Danzo-sama will not approve. He may consider it a betrayal of my original purpose. Probably, Yamato admitted honestly. I won't pretend otherwise. This is a real risk, Sai, and I won't ask you to take it lightly. But I think, if you're asking me honestly, I think this might be the first real chance you've had to decide who you actually want to be, rather than who you were built to become. Sai was silent for a long moment, his brush resting motionless beside the half-finished painting. I will consider it, he said finally. I would like to speak with Naruto directly, before making a final decision. That's fair, Yamato said, rising to his feet. He'll be glad to hear that. For what it's worth, Sai, I think you're capable of far more than Root ever gave you credit for. Sai looked up at him then, something unreadable flickering across his careful expression. Thank you, Yamato Taishu, he said quietly. It wasn't the practiced, hollow politeness Yamato remembered from Sai's earliest days with the team. There was something almost like genuine warmth buried underneath it. Yamato allowed himself a small, hopeful smile as he turned to leave, unaware, as Naruto had been that same morning at the Hyuga compound, that their entire conversation had been observed from a distance, catalogued with clinical precision, and was already being relayed back toward that same windowless room beneath the ruins of Konoha's administrative district. By that evening, Danzo had 3 names. He sat in the same near-darkness as the night before, the same single candle burning low on the table, listening in cold, patient silence as his operative relayed everything that had transpired throughout the day. Hinata's recruitment at the Hyuga compound, Shikamaru's reluctant agreement on the hillside overlooking the Nara clan's pasture, and most significantly, Yamato's conversation with Sai. When the report finished, Danzo remained silent for a long moment, his single visible eye fixed on the flickering candle flame, his expression as unreadable as ever. Sai, he said finally, testing the name the way he might test a blade for hidden flaws. The boy intends to recruit Sai. It appears Sai has not yet given a final answer, Danzo-sama, the operative reported. He requested time to speak with Naruto directly before making his decision. Danzo's fingers, resting against the table's edge, tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of whatever calculation was taking place behind that impassive, weathered face. Sai had been one of his most promising operatives, trained from childhood, conditioned carefully, shaped into precisely the kind of tool Danzo believed Konoha needed in a world that did not reward sentiment or hesitation. To lose him now, to the very sentimentality Danzo had spent years training out of him, would represent more than a simple loss of an asset. It would represent a crack in the foundation of everything Danzo had built. Proof, however small, that the conditioning he'd relied on for decades was not as absolute as he had always believed. That could not be permitted to stand unchallenged. Do not intervene directly. Not yet, Danzo said finally, his voice low and measured. If Sai chooses to join this unit of his own volition, forcing the matter now would only confirm to him, and to the Uzumaki boy, exactly the kind of control we cannot afford to be seen exercising, not while the council is watching my every move so closely in the wake of the invasion. Understood, Danzo-sama? But Danzo continued, and something colder entered his voice, something that promised patience was not the same as surrender. Should Sai choose to join this fledgling unit, he will not be beyond our reach simply because he no longer answers directly to Root's chain of command. Conditioning as deep as his does not simply vanish because a boy with more heart than sense offers him a kind word and a painted smile in return. A faint, humorless almost smile touched the corner of Danzo's mouth. Continue monitoring the situation. I want to know every name added to this list, every mission they undertake, every weakness this fledgling unit reveals in the course of its operation. If it proves useful to allow it to exist a while longer before I decide how, and when, to act, then that is precisely what we shall do. The masked operative bowed once and vanished silently back into the shadows, leaving Danzo alone once more with his candle and his calculations, already turning the pieces of this new, unexpected game over in his mind 3 moves ahead of everyone else at the table, exactly as he always was. Naruto, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. He sat that night at Ichiraka Ramen, 3 empty bowls stacked in front of him, filling Tucci and Ayamin on the broad strokes of his day, leaving out the parts about Tsunade's charter and the specific unit he was building, of course, since he'd promised to keep things quiet for now, but unable to entirely hide the restless, nervous energy buzzing under his skin. You've got that look tonight, Ayam said, refilling his water glass with an knowing smile. The one you get right before something big happens. Do I? Naruto asked, grinning despite the exhaustion of the day finally starting to catch up with him. You do, Tucci confirmed, chuckling as he worked the noodles in the pot behind the counter. Whatever it is, I hope it goes well for you, Naruto. This village could use a little good news, after everything. Yeah, Naruto said quietly, staring down at his empty bowl, thinking about Hinata's tears at the Hyuga compound, Shikamaru's grief-heavy agreement on the hillside, Yamato's careful, hopeful conversation with Sai that he hadn't even been present for but had heard about secondhand, and the strange, complicated hope building in his chest despite everything. 3 names, maybe 4 if Sai agreed. A month to prove this could actually work. And somewhere out there, in the shadows of a village still rebuilding itself brick by brick, a man who had already decided this fledgling project represented exactly the kind of threat he could not allow to grow unchecked. You know how sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't the monster you can see coming. It's the one quietly watching from the shadows, deciding exactly when to make its move? Naruto didn't know it yet, sitting there at Ichiraka's counter with his 3rd empty ramen bowl and a growing sense of cautious hope. But somewhere beneath the ruins of the village he just spent 3 exhausting days fighting to protect, that shadow had already begun to move. Sai said yes. He found Naruto 2 days after his conversation with Yamato, waiting outside the ramen stand at an hour when he clearly knew Naruto would be there, holding a small folded piece of paper in one hand instead of announcing himself the way most people would. I have decided to join your unit, he said, without any preamble at all, handing Naruto the paper before he even fully processed what was happening. I painted this. I am told gifts are customary when beginning something new, though I am uncertain if this fits that convention correctly. Naruto unfolded it to find a small, careful ink sketch, the four of them, himself, Hinata, Shikamaru, and Yamato, rendered in quick confident strokes standing together against the rising sun. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off, the way Sai's people paintings always were, like he was still working out from the outside in what genuine human warmth was supposed to look like. But there was something in it, something trying, something reaching for connection instead of simply observing it from a careful distance, that made Naruto's chest go tight in a way 3 days of grief and rebuilding hadn't quite managed. "This is great, Sai," Naruto said, and meant it completely. "Seriously. Welcome to the team." "You have not asked me why I decided to join," Sai observed, tilting his head slightly, the gesture still carrying a trace of the mechanical curiosity that had defined him during his first weeks on Team 7, though something warmer had crept into his expression since then. "Didn't think I needed to," Naruto said, grinning. "You wanted to. That's enough for me." Sai considered this for a long moment, something almost like surprise flickering behind his dark eyes. "That is a very different way of thinking than I am accustomed to," he said finally. "Yeah, well," Naruto said, clapping him on the shoulder, "get used to it. That's kind of the whole point of this team. 4 names. Naruto had his squad, or at least the beginning of one. But having a team on paper and having a team that actually works together under pressure? Those are 2 very different things, and Naruto's about to find out exactly how different, whether he's ready for it or not. Tsunade's tent had been upgraded slightly by the time Naruto brought his 4 recruits before her 3 days later, canvas walls reinforced, a proper wooden desk salvaged from somewhere replacing the makeshift kitchen table, though the general atmosphere of hurried, exhausted crisis management hadn't changed much. Shizen stood at Tsunade's side as always, and this time Naruto noticed a new addition to the room, a large map of Konoha's border territories pinned to a standing board, marked with red ink in several places along the eastern trade routes. "So," Tsunade said, looking over the 4 of them, Naruto, Hinata, Shikamaru, Sai, with Yamato standing slightly behind them, arms crossed, the posture of someone observing rather than being formally presented. "This is your team." "This is my team," Naruto confirmed, unable to keep a note of pride out of his voice. Tsunade's gaze swept across each of them in turn, assessing, weighing something behind her sharp brown eyes. When she reached Sai, her expression flickered, not hostile, exactly, but cautious, and Naruto understood immediately why. Sai's history with Root wasn't a secret from Tsunade, even if most of the rest of the village had no idea. "Sai," Tsunade said slowly, "I'm aware of your former assignment, under Danzo's authority. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. If you're here as an extension of Root's interests rather than a genuine member of this unit, I will find out. And the consequences will not be pleasant." "I understand, Hokage-sama," Sai said, his voice steady, careful in the particular way that had once seemed hollow but now, to Naruto's ear at least, carried something more like quiet conviction. "I am here because I choose to be. Not because I was ordered to be." Tsunade studied him a moment longer before nodding, apparently satisfied, at least for now. "Good," she said. "Because I meant what I told Naruto. This unit does not exist to settle scores with Root. It exists to defend this village against threats we currently have no adequate answer for. If that changes, if I discover this has become something else, the charter is void immediately, no exceptions, no second chances." Her eyes swept back across the group. "Understood?" A chorus of quiet affirmations answered her. "Good," Tsunade said again, and something in her posture shifted, the Hokage settling more fully into the role. "Now, before I grant this unit any kind of ongoing status, even unofficial, even probationary, I need proof that you can actually function as a cohesive team under real pressure. Not training exercises, a real mission, with real stakes." She turned, gesturing toward the map pinned to the board behind her. Shizen stepped forward, tracing a finger along one of the marked routes near the eastern border. "We've received reports over the past week of a bandit group operating along this trade corridor," Shizen explained. "Small scale at first, extortion, theft from merchant caravans, the usual. But 3 days ago, They hit a supply convoy moving between here and the border checkpoint and made off with a sealed shipment that included several scrolls being transferred from our archive to a satellite storage facility for safekeeping during the reconstruction. What kind of scrolls? Shikamaru asked immediately, his tactical mind already working. That's classified above genin clearance, normally, Tsunade said, but given the circumstances, I'll tell you what I told the search team already dispatched and lost track of the group 2 days ago. Nothing S-rank. No forbidden techniques, no clan secrets that would represent a catastrophic breach if they fell into the wrong hands. But sensitive enough that I want them back, and I want to know exactly who these bandits are working for. Because a group of common thieves does not typically know which specific crate in a convoy is worth stealing. Naruto felt something sharpen in his chest at that. The same instinct that had been nagging at him since the crater. The sense that things in this village were rarely as simple as they first appeared. This is your trial mission, Tsunade continued. Track the bandit group, recover the scrolls, and bring back whatever information you can about who they're working with or for. You have 5 days. If you succeed, and I mean succeed cleanly, without unnecessary casualties or diplomatic incidents, I'll extend your charter and start seriously considering what a permanent version of this unit might look like. If you fail, or if this turns into a disaster, we're having a very different conversation about whether this idea was ever viable to begin with. Naruto glanced sideways at his team, at Hinata's steady, focused nod, Shikamaru's already calculating expression, Sai's careful attentiveness, Yamato's quiet, experienced readiness, and felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty exactly, but something close to it. We'll get it done, he said. Tsunade's expression softened, just slightly, something almost like hope flickering behind the exhaustion still etched into her features. See that you do, she said. Dismissed. They left the village before dawn the next morning, moving in a loose formation through the tree line east of Konoha, following the trade route Shizen had marked on the map toward the last confirmed sighting of the bandit group. Now, if you've watched enough of my other What If series, you know that first missions are never quite as simple as they look on paper. And this one's about to prove that rule true in a big way. So what's the plan? Naruto asked, falling into step beside Shikamaru as they moved through the trees. The plan, Shikamaru said, is that we don't have one yet, because we don't have enough information. Rushing in without a clear picture of what we're dealing with is how people get killed. We need to actually track this group first, figure out their numbers, their patterns, whether they're operating out of a fixed base or moving constantly, before we even think about engaging them directly. Right, of course, Naruto said, nodding along, though the impatient set of his shoulders suggested restraint wasn't exactly his natural state. Hinata, Shikamaru continued, once we're close enough to the last known sighting, I'll need you scouting ahead with your Byakugan, wide-range reconnaissance, looking for any sign of their camp or recent activity. Sai, I can send out an ink bird to survey a broader area from above, Sai offered immediately, already reaching for the scroll and brush tucked into his equipment pouch. It would allow us to cover significantly more ground than ground-based scouting alone. Shikamaru's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his usually unreadable expression. That's actually a good idea. Do it once we're within range. Sai gave a small nod, something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile touching the corner of his mouth. Subtle, but there. Yamato, moving at the rear of their formation with the quiet, alert watchfulness of someone who'd spent years operating exactly this kind of mission, spoke up next. I'll handle terrain modification if we need it, he said. Wood style can create cover, barriers, or rapid movement platforms depending on what the engagement calls for. But I'd recommend we avoid direct engagement entirely if possible. A clean recovery with minimal contact is always preferable to a fight, especially on a team's first real mission together. Agreed, Shikamaru said. Naruto. I know, Naruto said, holding up both hands. Don't just charge in. I was going to say your shadow clones would be useful for covering ground quickly once we've identified their location, Shikamaru said dryly. But sure, that works too. Naruto laughed, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Right. Yeah. I can do that. They moved on through the forest in relative silence after that, each of them settling into the rhythm of the mission. Though Naruto couldn't help but notice the subtle awkwardness still threading through the group, the way Sai kept a careful half-step of distance from the others even while contributing genuinely useful ideas, the way Shikamaru's directions came out more like orders than suggestions, the way Hinata, despite her clear competence, still seemed to be waiting for permission before fully asserting herself. A team is more than just 4 skilled people standing next to each other. And this squad's about to learn that the hard way. They reached the area of the last confirmed sighting by mid-afternoon, a stretch of dense forest bordering the trade route where a merchant caravan had reported the ambush 3 days earlier. Wagon tracks, still visible in the packed dirt, veered sharply off the main road into the trees, evidence of the attack, or the aftermath of it. "All right," Shikamaru said, crouching to examine the tracks. "Hinata, if you would." Hinata nodded, activating her Byakugan with a soft pulse of chakra, the veins around her eyes bulging faintly as her vision expanded outward in a wide, three-dimensional sweep of the surrounding terrain. She was quiet for almost a full minute, scanning methodically, before finally speaking. "I can see a structure approximately 2 kilometers northeast of our position," she reported, her voice steady and clear in a way that made Naruto's chest swell with quiet pride. "It appears to be a converted logging outpost, abandoned originally, but recently reoccupied. I count 11 individuals inside and around the perimeter. Several crates stacked near what looks like a central storage building, consistent with stolen goods." 11, Shikamaru repeated, frowning slightly. "That's more than a standard bandit operation would typically run with." "Sai, can you get your ink bird up to confirm the layout from above?" Sai nodded, quickly unrolling a blank scroll and dipping his brush into a small pot of ink. With a few swift, confident strokes, he brought to life a small bird made of living ink, which lifted off his palm and soared silently up into the canopy above, disappearing from view as it climbed toward a vantage point over the distant outpost. They waited in tense silence for several minutes before the bird returned, diving back down towards Sai and dissolving back into a flat ink image on his scroll, the information transferring directly into his awareness. "The Byakugan's assessment is accurate," Sai confirmed, studying the scroll. 11 individuals, a central storage structure, and what appears to be a watchtower on the northern perimeter with at least 1 lookout stationed at all times. The compound is fenced, though the fencing appears to be a relatively simple wooden construction, not reinforced for serious combat. "Good work, both of you," Shikamaru said, and Naruto caught the slight straightening of Hinata's shoulders at the praise, the small, pleased flicker in Sai's expression. "See, this is exactly the kind of team dynamic Naruto was hoping for when he started this whole project. Everyone contributing, everyone's skills actually matching. Almost like it's going too smoothly, right?" "Yeah. Don't get comfortable." Shikamaru studied the rough sketch Sai had drawn based on the ink bird's reconnaissance, his expression thoughtful. 11 bandits with a fenced compound and a watchtower is more organization than a typical opportunistic group, he said slowly. "That, plus the fact that they knew exactly which crate to target in that convoy, makes me think this isn't a random bandit operation. Someone's running this, and running it with actual planning." "You think someone hired them specifically to steal those scrolls?" Naruto asked. "I think," Shikamaru said carefully, "that it's a strong possibility we need to keep in mind, yeah? Which changes our approach here. We're not just cleaning up common thieves. If there's an actual organizer behind this, someone who might not even be present at that compound, recovering the scrolls might not be the whole mission. Finding out who's actually behind this could matter just as much." Naruto felt that same uneasy prickle from Tsunade's tent settle back into his chest. "All right," he said. "So what's the plan?" Shikamaru was quiet for a long moment, studying the sketch, running through possibilities with the same rapid, methodical calculation Naruto had seen him apply to every serious problem since the Chunin exams years ago. "We wait until nightfall," he said finally. "Approaching in daylight against a watchtower with a clear sight line is asking for trouble, especially against a group organized enough to actually maintain proper lookout rotations. Once it's dark, Hinata scouts the interior layout more precisely. I want to know exactly where those crates are stored and whether there's any indication of who's actually running this operation. Sai and I handle the watchtower quietly, without alerting the rest of the compound. Yamato, you and Naruto move in for the crates once the perimeter's clear, and we get out before anyone even realizes we were there." "And if it doesn't stay quiet?" Yamato asked evenly. Shikamaru's jaw tightened slightly. "Then we adapt." but a clean extraction is the goal. Tsunade-sama was pretty clear about wanting this handled without unnecessary casualties or a diplomatic mess. They settled into the tree line to wait for nightfall, the tension of the coming mission settling over the group in a way that made even Naruto, usually the first to fill silence with restless chatter, unusually quiet. Night fell fully by the time Shikamaru gave the signal to move. The forest around the logging outpost had gone dark and quiet, the kind of stillness that made every small sound, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, feel amplified tenfold. Hinata led the way, moving with careful, practiced silence, her Byakugan active, mapping the compound's interior with methodical precision as they crept closer through the underbrush. Confirmed, she whispered, once they'd reached a position close enough to observe the compound directly. The crates are stored in the central building, second room from the entrance. I count the same 11 individuals. 9 appear to be sleeping in a bunkhouse on the compound's western side, 1 is stationed in the watchtower, and 1 is awake near the central building. Though he appears to be, she paused, frowning slightly, adjusting her focus, reviewing documents. Written correspondence, it looks like. That could be our organizer, or at least someone with information about them, Shikamaru murmured. All right. Sai, watchtower first, quiet as you can manage. I'll cover you from the ground in case anything goes wrong. Sai nodded, already unrolling a fresh scroll, brush moving in quick, practiced strokes. A moment later, a small ink hawk lifted silently from his palm, gliding through the darkness toward the watchtower with barely a whisper of sound. Naruto watched, genuinely impressed despite the tension of the moment, as the hawk swooped down toward the lone lookout, ink tendrils extending outward to wrap silently around the man's mouth and limbs, rendering him instantly, soundlessly immobilized. Watchtower secure, Sai reported quietly. Nice work, Shikamaru murmured. All right. Yamato, Naruto, the crates. Yamato and Naruto moved forward together, keeping low, sticking to the shadows cast by the compound's outer buildings. The awake bandit near the central building, the one reviewing documents Hinata had spotted, remained focused on his papers, oblivious to their approach, as Yamato guided a thin, controlled route of living wood up through the ground beneath him with barely a whisper of sound, wrapping around his ankles and yanking him off balance before he could so much as call out. Naruto was on him in an instant, a swift, precise strike to a pressure point rendering the man unconscious before he even fully registered what was happening. Clean. Efficient. Exactly the kind of operation Naruto had been hoping this team could pull off. Naruto quickly gathered up the scattered papers the man had been reviewing, stuffing them into his jacket for later examination, while Yamato moved toward the central building's entrance, testing the door. Locked, he murmured. Naruto? Naruto grinned despite the tension, cracking his knuckles. On it. A few precise strikes to the door's hinges later, and they were inside, moving quickly toward the second room Hinata had identified, where they found the stolen crates stacked exactly as described, sealed with Konoha's official transport markings still visible, undisturbed. Got them, Naruto whispered back toward Shikamaru's position. Ready to move. Copy that, Shikamaru's voice came back quietly. Let's, and that was exactly when everything went wrong. A sharp, piercing whistle cut through the night, an alarm signal. Naruto realized a half-second too late, coming from somewhere near the bunkhouse. Someone had woken up. Someone had noticed something amiss, or maybe just gotten unlucky timing on a trip to relieve themselves, and now the whole compound was waking up in a chaotic scramble of shouted alerts and hurried footsteps. Move now! Shikamaru's voice cut through the darkness, all pretense of stealth abandoned. Naruto, Yamato, get those crates out of there! Naruto and Yamato hauled the crates up between them, moving quickly back toward the building's entrance just as the first bandits came pouring out of the bunkhouse, weapons drawn, shouting confused alerts to each other in the darkness. 9 against 4, Sai observed calmly, already reaching for another scroll as he moved to cover Shikamaru's position. Manageable odds, assuming they're not significantly more skilled than their organizational structure suggests. Manageable is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Shikamaru muttered, already forming hand seals, shadow stretching out from his position to snake across the ground toward the nearest group of bandits. His shadow possession jutsu caught 3 of them mid-stride, freezing them in place with startled shouts. Hinata moved next, a blur of control, precise motion as she engaged two bandits who'd broken toward her position. Her gentle fist strikes finding pressure points with surgical accuracy even in the chaotic darkness, dropping both of them within seconds. But it was clear almost immediately that this wasn't going to be as clean as Shikamaru's plan had intended. More bandits than the 11 Hinata had originally counted came pouring out from what must have been a second, previously hidden structure on the compound's far side, at least 6 more, better armed than the disorganized group they'd initially engaged, moving with the kind of coordinated discipline that made Naruto's stomach drop. Remember how Shikamaru said 11 bandits with a fenced compound and organized lookouts felt like more planning than a typical bandit operation? Yeah. Turns out he was righter than any of them wanted him to be. There's more of them than we accounted for, Naruto shouted, setting down the crate he'd been carrying and forming a hand seal. Shadow Clone Jutsu. A dozen clones sprang into existence around him, immediately fanning out to intercept the newly emerged bandits before they could reach Shikamaru and Hinata's positions. The fight devolved quickly into chaos. Clashing steel, shouted commands, the flare of jutsu lighting up the darkness in brief, violent bursts. Yamato, still holding one of the recovered crates, found himself suddenly flanked by 2 of the better-armed bandits, forcing him to set the crate down and engage directly. Wood-style constructs rising from the ground to intercept their strikes even as he worked to keep them from breaking through toward the others. Sai, cover Hinata's flank, Shikamaru shouted, still maintaining his shadow possession on the original 3 bandits even as he fought to track the rapidly shifting battlefield. Naruto, we need those crates secured, not sitting exposed in the open. Kind of busy, Naruto shot back, driving a clone-assisted punch into an approaching bandit's jaw. It was, Naruto would reflect later, exactly the kind of moment that revealed all the cracks the team hadn't yet had time to smooth over. Sai's ink constructs, while genuinely effective, operated on a rhythm and timing that didn't quite sync naturally with Hinata's close-quarters gentle fist style, leading to a brief, dangerous moment where an ink serpent Sai had summoned to intercept an incoming bandit nearly collided with Hinata's own strike, forcing her to abort mid-motion and take a glancing hit to the shoulder that she otherwise would have easily avoided. Sorry, Sai called, genuine distress cutting through his usually careful, controlled tone. I did not anticipate. It's fine, keep going, Hinata called back, wincing but pressing forward anyway, driving her attacker back with a series of rapid strikes despite the pain clearly radiating from her shoulder. Shikamaru, meanwhile, was rapidly running out of chakra, maintaining his shadow possession against 3 struggling captives while simultaneously trying to track the overall battlefield and call out tactical adjustments, a burden that, Naruto realized watching from across the chaos, was clearly too much for one person to manage alone, no matter how brilliant his tactical mind was. Shikamaru, let them go and fall back, Naruto shouted, dispatching another bandit with a solid clone-assisted haymaker. You're stretched too thin. If I let them go they'll just... Shikamaru started, but the strain in his voice cut off as one of his captives, straining against the shadow possession's hold, managed to wrench an arm free enough to hurl a kunai directly toward Shikamaru's exposed position. Time seemed to slow down for Naruto in that instant, the kunai spinning through the darkness, Shikamaru's shadow jutsu locking him in place, unable to dodge without breaking the technique and freeing all 3 of his captives simultaneously. Shikamaru! Yamato moved first, a thick root of living wood erupting from the ground between Shikamaru and the incoming kunai, intercepting the blade with a solid thunk a bare instant before it would have found its mark. But the movement cost Yamato precious focus, and one of the bandits he'd been holding off used the opening to land a solid strike across his ribs, sending him staggering back with a pained grunt. This is exactly the moment every new team fears. The point where good individual skill isn't enough, where the cracks in coordination that seemed minor in training suddenly become the difference between success and disaster. Fall back to the treeline, regroup, Naruto shouted, dispatching 2 more clones to cover Yamato's retreat while pulling the last of the crates up onto his shoulder. We've got the scrolls, we don't need to win this fight, we just need to get out. It took several more tense, chaotic minutes, Hinata dropping 2 more bandits despite her injured shoulder, Sai finally finding a rhythm that worked alongside rather than against the others' movements, Shikamaru releasing his captives and falling back the moment Yamato's wood-style barrier gave him the opening to do so safely, but eventually, the team managed to disengage, retreating into the darkness of the surrounding forest with the recovered crates in tow, leaving a compound full of confused, disorganized bandits behind them, unwilling or unable to pursue into unfamiliar terrain at night against opponents who just demonstrated considerably more capability than expected. They didn't stop running until they were nearly 3 kilometers from the compound, finally collapsing into an exhausted, breathless huddle in a small forest clearing, adrenaline still coursing visibly through every one of them. "Everyone all right?" Naruto asked, once he'd caught enough breath to actually form words, looking around at his team with genuine concern. "Shoulders not great," Hinata admitted, wincing as she gingerly rotated her injured arm, "but it's not serious. I can still function." "Bruised ribs, probably," Yamato said, pressing a hand carefully against his side, though his voice remained steady, controlled despite the obvious pain. "Nothing life-threatening. Good reflexes, by the way, Naruto. Calling the retreat when you did probably saved us from a considerably worse outcome." "That should have gone smoother," Shikamaru said quietly, staring down at his hands, still faintly trembling from the chakra exhaustion of maintaining his shadow possession for so long. "I miscounted their numbers. I should have insisted on a longer reconnaissance before we moved in, instead of assuming 11 was the full count just because that's what we'd initially observed." "Hey," Naruto said firmly. "We got the scrolls. Nobody died." "That's not a failure, Shikamaru." "It's not a success either," Shikamaru shot back, more sharply than he probably intended, the words carrying the particular bitterness of someone who held himself to standards nobody else in the group was demanding of him. "I almost got hit because I was too slow to adjust the plan when the numbers changed. Yamato got hurt covering for my mistake. Hinata took a hit because Sai and her styles weren't synced properly. This is exactly the kind of coordination failure that gets people killed against a real threat, not just a group of overqualified bandits." The clearing went quiet for a moment, the weight of Shikamaru's words settling uncomfortably over the group. "He's not wrong," Sai said finally, breaking the silence, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness Naruto might have expected. "My ink constructs are not accustomed to operating alongside a close-quarters combat style like Hinata-san's. I need to adjust my timing and positioning considerably if we are to avoid similar incidents in future engagements. And I should have called for the retreat sooner," Yamato added, "rather than allowing myself to get pinned down covering 2 opponents alone. I let my focus on protecting Shikamaru's position distract me from tracking my own engagement properly." Naruto looked around at his team, Hinata cradling her injured shoulder but still holding herself with quiet, determined steadiness. Shikamaru visibly frustrated with himself but clearly already turning the failure over in his mind, working toward whatever lesson could be extracted from it. Sai processing the whole experience with the same careful, earnest attentiveness he brought to everything. Yamato steady and calm despite his own injuries, and felt something settle in his chest that was equal parts pride and resolve. "You know what's actually more impressive than a team that never makes mistakes? A team that owns its mistakes honestly, and immediately starts figuring out how to fix them. That's exactly what's happening in this clearing right now. Look," Naruto said, "nobody's perfect on their first real mission together. We didn't know each other's rhythms yet, we got surprised by numbers that weren't in the initial intel, and things got messy. That's just what happens. But we adapted. We got out. We got the scrolls." He gestured toward the recovered crates. "And now we know exactly what we need to work on before the next time. That's not failure. That's just what training actually looks like, when it's real instead of just theoretical." Shikamaru was quiet for a long moment, then finally let out a slow, tired breath, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Yeah," he admitted. "All right. You're right. We adapt, we get better. No point dwelling on it more than necessary." He glanced toward Naruto, something almost like genuine respect flickering behind his usually guarded expression. "That was a good call, by the way. Ordering the retreat when you did. I was too locked into my original plan to see it clearly." "Don't get used to me being the voice of reason," Naruto said, grinning despite the exhaustion. "Usually that's your job." Shikamaru managed a small, tired laugh despite himself. "Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head." They made camp in the clearing for what remained of the night, taking shifts to keep watch while the others rested and Hinata's shoulder was treated with the basic field medical supplies Yamato carried. It was during Naruto's watch, sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, that he finally pulled out the papers he'd stuffed into his jacket during the raid. The documents the awake bandit had been reviewing when they'd first infiltrated the compound. He unfolded them carefully by the dim light of a small, carefully shielded fire, squinting at the handwriting in the darkness. Most of it was mundane: inventory lists, notes about caravan schedules, the kind of operational planning any organized bandit group might keep. But one page, tucked near the back of the small stack, made Naruto's blood run cold. It was a payment ledger. Amounts, dates, brief coded notations he couldn't fully decipher, but at the top of the page, faint but unmistakable, was a small, official-looking stamp. Not a merchant's seal, not a criminal organization's mark, a Konoha administrative seal. The kind used for internal mission authorization documents. The kind, Naruto realized with a slowly dawning, uneasy horror, that he'd seen before, on old mission scrolls, on internal village paperwork, on documents that should never, under any circumstances, have found their way into the hands of a group of hired bandits operating outside official village sanction. "Shikamaru," Naruto said quietly, his voice tight. "Wake up. You need to see this." Shikamaru, a light sleeper by habit born of years of shinobi training, was awake and alert within seconds, moving to Naruto's side and studying the document by the dim firelight, his expression shifting rapidly from sleepy confusion to sharp, focused concern. "That's an internal authorization seal," he said slowly, tracing the stamp with careful fingers. "This isn't just some bandit group that got lucky targeting the right crate. Someone inside the village, someone with access to internal administrative processes, authorized or facilitated this." "You think it's root," Naruto said. It wasn't really a question. Shikamaru was quiet for a long, tense moment, studying the seal more closely, his sharp mind clearly working through implications either of them particularly wanted to consider. "I think," he said finally carefully, "that this seal pattern looks similar to internal authorization codes I've seen on a few older mission records. Records that were technically closed out, officially, years ago, but that I remember Asuma-sensei mentioning once, offhand, as belonging to a division that operated with unusual autonomy from standard chain of command." His jaw tightened. "I can't be certain without comparing it directly to archived records. But if I'm right about what this seal actually represents, Naruto, then this wasn't just a bandit raid," Naruto finished quietly, staring down at the damning little stamp in the firelight, feeling the full weight of what Tsunade had warned him about settling heavily over his shoulders. This was root. Testing us. Or covering something up. Or both. Overhead the sky had begun, almost imperceptibly, to lighten toward dawn, but in that small forest clearing, with a damning piece of evidence held carefully between them and the exhausted, injured remains of Konoha's newest, still unofficial elite unit sleeping fitfully nearby, it felt, to Naruto, distinctly like the darkness was only just beginning. They reached Konoha's gates just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, four exhausted, bruised shinobi and a fifth carrying a small folded paper that felt, to Naruto, considerably heavier than the crates of recovered scrolls slung across his and Yamato's shoulders. Nobody spoke much on the final stretch home. Hinata's shoulder had stiffened overnight despite Yamato's field treatment, and she carried it carefully, jaw set against the discomfort rather than complaining. Shikamaru walked with the particular quiet of someone still running calculations in his head, turning the implications of that damning seal over and over, looking for an angle that made it mean something less dangerous than what it obviously meant. Sai walked slightly apart, as he often did, though Naruto had noticed over the past few days that the distance seemed less like deliberate isolation now and more like simple habit, something Sai was still, slowly, deliberately unlearning. You know that feeling when you've got information that's going to change everything, and you're not entirely sure yet how to say it out loud? Yeah, that's exactly where this team is right now, walking back through Konoha's gates. The village around them was busier than it had been 3 days earlier, more scaffolding up, more sections of wall rebuilt, more of the frantic, disaster response energy giving way to the steadier rhythm of long-term reconstruction. It should have felt hopeful. Mostly it did, but Naruto couldn't shake the folded paper sitting like a stone in his jacket pocket, and the knowledge that whatever this village was rebuilding itself into, There were still people inside its walls working very hard to keep certain things buried. Tsunade was in a proper office by the time they returned, not the tent from before, but a salvaged administrative building on the reconstruction site's edge, structurally sound enough to serve as a temporary headquarters while the actual Hokage's tower was rebuilt from the ground up. She looked up from a stack of paperwork the moment they entered, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging the visible signs of a mission that hadn't gone entirely smoothly. Hinata's carefully held shoulder, the faint bruising along Yamato's ribs visible where his shirt had shifted, the general exhaustion etched into all their faces. "You're alive," she said, setting down her pen. "That's a good start." "Report." Naruto set the recovered crates down carefully on the floor in front of her desk. "Scrolls recovered, all sealed, markings intact. 11 bandits at the compound. Turned out to be more like 17 once reinforcements showed up we hadn't accounted for. Nobody killed on either side, though it got messier than planned before we managed a clean extraction." Tsunade's eyebrows rose slightly at the correction in numbers. 17. "That's a significant miscalculation from the initial reconnaissance." "My mistake," Shikamaru said immediately, before Naruto could say anything to soften it. "I should have insisted on more thorough scouting before committing to the extraction plan." "It won't happen again." Tsunade studied him for a moment, something almost approving in her expression despite the seriousness of the conversation. "Good. Owning a mistake instead of burying it is exactly the kind of thing that keeps the team alive long term." "Continue." Naruto exchanged a glance with Shikamaru, then reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded papers he'd recovered from the compound, setting them carefully on Tsunade's desk. "There's something else," he said. "We recovered documents from one of the bandits, payment records mostly. But there's a seal on one of the pages. Shikamaru thinks it might match an internal Konoha authorization stamp." "An old one." Tsunade's expression shifted instantly, the mild approval from a moment ago hardening into something far more focused. She reached for the paper, unfolding it carefully, her sharp eyes scanning down to the small stamped mark near the top. The room went very quiet as she studied it. "Shizen," Tsunade said finally, her voice carefully level in a way that told Naruto she was working hard to keep it that way. "Bring me the archive index. The full one, going back at least 15 years. Shizen, who'd been standing quietly near the door, nodded and disappeared immediately, returning a few minutes later with a heavy, dust-covered ledger that she set carefully on the desk. Tsunade flipped through it with quick, practiced efficiency, occasionally pausing to compare a page against the seal on the document Naruto had brought back, her jaw tightening a fraction more with each comparison. Finally, she set the ledger down and let out a long, slow breath, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again, sharp and grim. "This seal pattern was retired officially 14 years ago," she said quietly. "Folded into general ANBU administration when a certain division was supposedly restructured under new oversight." Her eyes flicked up to meet Naruto's, and there was something in them he'd rarely seen from her. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. The wariness of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the ground they were standing on had suddenly become. It never actually stopped being used. It just stopped being visible to anyone outside a very small circle. "Root," Shikamaru said quietly. It wasn't a question this time either. "I can't confirm that with absolute certainty from a single seal on a payment ledger," Tsunade said, though her tone made it clear she considered the alternative explanations vanishingly unlikely. "But I'd be lying if I told you it doesn't fit a pattern I've suspected for years and never had enough concrete evidence to act on. And there it is, the confirmation this squad's first real mission wasn't just a training exercise gone slightly sideways. It was a direct brush with exactly the kind of shadow operation Naruto suspected was still running unchecked underneath the village." "So what do we do?" Naruto asked, leaning forward, the exhaustion of the past 2 days momentarily forgotten in the face of the discovery. "Nothing," Tsunade said firmly, and the word landed hard enough in the room that Naruto actually flinched slightly. "Nothing?" he repeated, incredulous. "Bachan, this is exactly the kind of thing." "I know what it's the kind of thing," Tsunade cut him off, her voice sharp but not unkind, more urgent than angry. "And I promise you, Naruto, this is not information I intend to sit on. But you brought me a single seal on a single document recovered from a group of hired bandits. That is not remotely enough evidence to move against a man who has spent 40 years building contingencies for exactly this kind of accusation. If I act on this now, prematurely, with insufficient proof, the absolute best outcome is that nothing happens and he knows exactly how much we've discovered, adjusts accordingly, and buries whatever trail existed even deeper than before. The worst outcome is considerably worse than that, for reasons I am not going to get into with a room full of exhausted genin who just got back from a 5-day mission. She held up the sealed document, folding it carefully and setting it into a drawer in her desk, which she locked with a small, deliberate click. This stays with me, she said. I will investigate it properly, carefully, through channels that won't tip our hand prematurely. In the meantime, your job, all of your jobs, is to continue exactly what you've been doing. Prove this unit is viable. Build something strong enough that when the moment does come to act on information like this, we actually have the strength to back it up. Naruto wanted to argue. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to push harder, to demand more immediate action, to march straight toward whatever shadowy corner of the village Danzo operated out of and confront him directly. But he thought about the promise he made in this same building, this same conversation, really, just 3 days and a lifetime of experience ago, about not using this charter to settle personal scores. So, do you push forward on instinct, the way Naruto's wanted to every single time something like this has come up? Or do you trust that sometimes the slower, more careful path is actually the stronger one? Okay, Naruto said finally, quietly, forcing the words out even though every part of him hated saying them. We'll keep building. Keep proving it works. Tsunade's expression softened slightly, something like genuine pride flickering behind the exhaustion and wariness still etched across her features. Good, she said. For what it's worth, you handled that mission well, all things considered. Adapting to an underestimated enemy force, extracting cleanly, bringing back intelligence nobody expected you to find. That's exactly the kind of resourcefulness I was hoping this unit might demonstrate. She leaned back in her chair, studying the 4 of them, 5, counting Yamato, who'd remained quietly attentive throughout the entire exchange. Effective immediately, your probationary charter is extended. I want to see this unit continue training and taking on missions at this level. We'll revisit a more permanent designation once I have a clearer picture of what we're actually dealing with underneath the surface. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Yamato said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered, with the kind of formal deference that came from years of ANBU protocol. Get some rest, all of you, Tsunade said, waving a hand toward the door. Hinata, I want Sakura or one of the other medics to look at that shoulder properly before you do anything else. That's not a request. Yes, Hokage-sama, Hinata said, managing a small, tired smile despite everything. They left the administrative building in a loose, exhausted cluster, the tension of the past 2 days finally beginning to ease now that the immediate crisis of reporting back had passed. But something had shifted in the group, Naruto could feel it, a kind of quiet, shared understanding that this project of his had just become considerably more serious than any of them had fully appreciated when they'd first agreed to join. So, Shikamaru said finally, breaking the silence as they walked. We're doing this for real now, apparently. Looks like it, Naruto agreed. We should probably talk about what this actually is, then, Shikamaru continued, glancing sideways at the group. Because right now we're just 4 people and a former ANBU captain that Naruto asked to join a thing that doesn't have a name, doesn't have official standing, and apparently now has a pretty significant conflict with the most dangerous political operator in the village. If we're going to keep doing this, we probably need to actually figure out what we are. Naruto considered this for a moment. What do you mean, what we are? I mean, Shikamaru said patiently, ANBU has code names. Masks. An identity that exists separate from who you are as a person, partly for operational security and partly because, I think, it helps people compartmentalize the weight of what they're doing. Root operates the same way, from what I understand, except more extreme about it, stripping away identity almost entirely. He glanced toward Sai as he said this, not unkindly, more observationally. If we're building something that's supposed to be different from that, something better, maybe we shouldn't just default to copying that same structure. Sai, walking a step behind the group as usual, seemed to consider this seriously. Root operatives are assigned designations rather than choosing them, he said. It reinforces the understanding that identity is secondary to function. I have often wondered whether choosing one's own designation, rather than having it assigned, would feel meaningfully different. I think it would, Hinata said quietly, the first thing she'd said since leaving Tsunade's office. Choosing something for yourself instead of having it handed to you, that changes what it means. Even something small. Naruto looked around at his team, at Shikamaru's thoughtful, considering expression, at Sai's genuine, careful curiosity, at Hinata's quiet conviction, at Yamato's steady, watchful attentiveness, and felt something click into place in his chest. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, okay. We should figure that out. Not right now, though. Everyone needs actual sleep first. But soon. What do you name something that's meant to represent everything Root isn't? A team built on choice instead of conditioning, on trust instead of control. That's a harder question than it sounds, and this squad's about to spend more time on it than they probably expect. They reconvened 3 days later, once Hinata's shoulder had healed properly under Sakura's care and everyone had gotten something closer to real rest. At a training ground Yamato had selected on the village's quieter eastern edge, undamaged by Pain's assault, surrounded by trees that gave the whole area a sense of privacy despite being well within the village's walls. Yamato was already there when the others arrived, methodically setting up a series of training obstacles using controlled bursts of wood style, rope courses strung between quickly grown trees, moving platforms designed to test balance and reaction time, a small cluster of training dummies arranged in a pattern that suggested some deliberate, complex exercise Naruto couldn't quite parse yet. All right, Yamato said, once everyone had gathered. Before we discuss anything else, I want to address something directly. What happened during the bandit mission? The coordination issues between Sai's ink constructs and Hinata's close-quarters style. Shikamaru overextending himself maintaining a technique without adequate support. Myself getting pinned down covering multiple engagements. None of that is unusual for a team's first real mission together. But it's also not something we can afford to let become a pattern. If this unit is going to face threats on the level Naruto originally proposed it for, we need training that specifically addresses working together. Not just training that makes each of us individually stronger. So what's the plan? Naruto asked, eyeing the obstacle course with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Today, we start building actual cohesion, Yamato said. Real ANBU training isn't just about raw skill. Plenty of shinobi have raw skill. It's about being able to trust, instinctively, that the person next to you is going to be exactly where you expect them to be, doing exactly what the situation calls for, without needing it spelled out verbally in the middle of a fight. That kind of trust doesn't come naturally. It has to be built, deliberately, through repetition and shared difficulty. He gestured toward the obstacle course. We'll start with something relatively simple. Coordinated movement drills, the 5 of us navigating this course together, blindfolded, relying entirely on verbal cues and a shared sense of each other's positioning. It sounds basic. It is not, in practice, nearly as easy as it sounds. It turned out Yamato was very much correct about that. The first attempt was, in Shikamaru's dry assessment afterward, an unmitigated disaster. Naruto, blindfolded and relying on Hinata's called-out directions, misjudged a rope bridge crossing entirely and ended up dangling upside down from a support line, laughing too hard to actually pull himself back up. Sai, attempting to navigate a section that required precise timing with Shikamaru's movements, moved a half-second too early, sending both of them tumbling into a soft landing pit Yamato had thoughtfully positioned beneath that particular obstacle. Hinata, despite her natural precision, found herself struggling with an exercise that required trusting verbal cues over her usual reliance on visual information, even with her Byakugan temporarily restricted by the blindfold. This is genuinely embarrassing, Shikamaru muttered, picking dirt out of his hair after his third fall of the session. It's supposed to be difficult, Yamato said, not unsympathetically, watching from the course's edge with the patient, unhurried demeanor of someone who'd clearly overseen exactly this kind of frustrating, necessary training many times before. The point isn't to succeed immediately. The point is to fail together, repeatedly, until failing together stops feeling embarrassing and starts feeling like information you can actually use. You know how sometimes the most important part of building a team isn't the big dramatic battle, it's the boring, frustrating, unglamorous work of just learning to trust each other? Yeah. This is exactly that. And honestly, it's kind of the good stuff. By the fifth attempt, something had started to shift. Naruto, still blindfolded, began actually listening, really listening, to the specific cadence of Hinata's voice, learning to distinguish urgency from caution in her tone even without seeing her expression. Sai, working alongside Shikamaru, started counting silently in his head, synchronizing his movements to a rhythm rather than trying to react purely to verbal instruction. A solution so quintessentially Sai, methodical, almost mathematical, that Shikamaru actually laughed out loud when he figured out what was happening. By the 10th attempt, they made it through the entire course without a single fall. Better, Yamato said, and there was genuine satisfaction in his voice as the five of them stood, blindfolds removed, breathing hard but grinning at each other with the particular giddy relief of people who'd just accomplished something that had seemed genuinely impossible an hour earlier. Considerably better. That's the foundation we're going to keep building on. Over the following days, the training continued, not every day, since Tsunade still occasionally called on individual members for other village duties during the ongoing reconstruction, but often enough that a rhythm began to establish itself. Yamato drilled them relentlessly on stealth protocols, teaching them to move as a coordinated unit through difficult terrain without the constant verbal communication that had nearly gotten them killed during the bandit mission. Shikamaru, once he'd had time to properly process the coordination failures from their first mission, began designing formations specifically tailored to the team's actual strengths, patterns that put Hinata's reconnaissance abilities at the front, sizing constructs in a supporting role that complemented rather than competed with close-quarters engagement, Yamato's wood style providing flexible terrain control, and Naruto's shadow clones as a scalable force multiplier that could adapt to whatever the situation demanded. Hinata, for her part, threw herself into refining her reconnaissance techniques with a dedication that visibly surprised even her, pushing the effective range of her Byakugan further than she'd ever needed to in standard missions, learning to communicate what she observed with the kind of concise, tactical clarity that came from genuinely understanding what information actually mattered in the middle of a fast-moving engagement. It was during one of these training sessions, late afternoon, the others having already dispersed for the day while Naruto lingered to help Hinata practice extending her Byakugan's range beyond its usual limits, that something shifted quietly between them. "You've gotten a lot more confident," Naruto observed, watching as Hinata completed another successful long-range scan, her form steady and controlled in a way that bore little resemblance to the hesitant, easily flustered girl he remembered from their academy days. Hinata lowered her hands, deactivating her Byakugan, a faint flush rising in her cheeks. Though this time, Naruto noted, it seemed less like nervous embarrassment, and more like genuine, quiet pride. "I think," she said carefully, "it's easier to be confident when someone actually gives you the chance to be. My family always focused on what I couldn't do, being here, being part of something where what I can do actually matters, where people listen when I report what I see instead of second-guessing it." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's different. Good different." Naruto smiled, something warm settling in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. "You always could do this stuff, Hinata. You just never had people around you who noticed." "You noticed," Hinata said quietly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made something in Naruto's chest tighten in an entirely different way than it had a moment ago. "You've always noticed, actually, even back when I didn't think anyone did." The moment stretched between them, comfortable and a little charged all at once, the late afternoon light filtering gold through the training grounds trees. Naruto started, then stopped, unsure exactly what he meant to say, feeling suddenly, uncharacteristically uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with tactics or missions, or the mounting political danger hanging over his fledgling squad. Hinata, for her part, seemed to understand the moment perfectly well without needing him to finish the sentence. She simply smiled, small, genuine, steady, and said, "We should probably head back. It's getting late." "Yeah," Naruto agreed, a little breathless in a way he couldn't fully explain, watching as she turned to gather her things, the fading sunlight catching in her dark hair. "Yeah, probably should. Now I know some of you have been waiting for this. And don't worry, this isn't the last time we're going to see these two circling around each other. But right now, this squad's got bigger problems on the horizon, and unfortunately for Naruto and Hinata both, There's not going to be a whole lot of time for quiet moments like this one in the days ahead. That evening, as Naruto walked home replaying the moment with Hinata over and over in his head with the particular obsessive focus of someone who very much did not want to examine his own feelings too closely, a considerably less pleasant conversation was taking place across the village. Sai received the summons quietly, delivered by a masked route operative who appeared without warning in the small apartment Sai had been assigned since his reassignment away from active field duty, a place he'd never fully thought of as home, more a functional space where a tool was stored between uses. Danzo-sama requests your presence. Immediately, Sai had known, on some level, that this moment was likely to come eventually. Yamato had warned him, when they'd first spoken about joining Naruto's unit, that Danzo would not simply allow him to walk away from Root's chain of command without at least attempting to reassert control. Still, receiving the actual summons sent a cold, familiar tightness through his chest, the particular, deeply conditioned anxiety of a subordinate being called before a superior he had spent his entire remembered life being trained to fear and obey without question. He followed the operative through the village's quieter back alleys, down familiar passages that led, eventually, to the same windowless underground room he'd been summoned to countless times before during his years of active route service. The single candle burned low on the table, exactly as it always had. Danzo sat behind it, exactly as he always did, his single visible eye tracking Sai's approach with the same cold, calculating patience Sai remembered from every previous encounter. Sai, Danzo said, his voice carrying the same flat, measured quality it always did, neither warm nor overtly hostile, simply, precisely controlled. It has been some time since your last report. I have not been assigned active duty requiring regular reports, Danzo-sama, Sai said carefully, falling automatically into the careful, deferential cadence he'd used his entire life within Root's structure. Even as some newer, quieter part of him recognized how strange it felt now, after weeks spent among people who spoke to each other with an entirely different kind of openness. Indeed, Danzo said. I understand you have found other occupation for your time. A new unit, I am told, assembled by the Uzumaki boy, operating with the Hokage's direct sanction, though notably absent from any official designation within the village's standard chain of command. Sai's expression remained carefully, practically neutral, though internally, something tightened further. I chose to join, Danzo-sama, he said quietly. It was not an assignment given to me. It was a decision I made independently. Something flickered behind Danzo's single visible eye, not anger, exactly. Something colder, more calculating, more patient than simple anger would have allowed for. A decision, Danzo repeated slowly, as though testing the unfamiliar shape of the word. You understand, I trust, precisely what you are, what I made you into through years of careful, deliberate training that most operatives could not have survived, let alone mastered as thoroughly as you did. Root does not create operatives capable of making decisions independent of their function. It creates tools, refined and precise, capable of extraordinary service specifically because sentiment and independent will have been carefully excised from the equation. I am aware of my training, Danzo-sama, Sai said, his voice steady despite the cold weight settling into his chest. And yet, Danzo continued, leaning forward slightly, the candlelight throwing sharp, unforgiving shadows across the weathered lines of his face. Here you stand, describing your involvement with an unsanctioned unit, one specifically conceived, if my information is accurate, in direct opposition to the very structures I have spent decades building to protect this village from threats sentiment and hesitation cannot adequately address, as a decision. As though the conditioning I invested in you across your entire remembered life could simply be discarded on a whim, in favor of whatever the Uzumaki boy happened to offer you in its place. Sai was quiet for a long moment, feeling the full weight of Danzo's careful, patient scrutiny pressing down on him, every instinct trained into him screaming to simply agree, to apologize, to fall back into the familiar, safe rhythm of unquestioning obedience that had defined his entire life until very recently. But he thought, unbidden, of the small ink painting he'd given Naruto, the four of them standing together against the rising sun, clumsy and imperfect but genuinely, deliberately his own creation. He thought of Yamato's quiet, patient kindness during their conversation in the garden. He thought of the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in his chest the moment Naruto had said you wanted to. That's enough for me, without a shred of suspicion or demand for further justification. With respect, Danzo-sama, Sai said finally, his voice quiet but steadier than he expected it to be, I do not believe it was a whim. I have spent considerable time attempting to understand what it means to form genuine connections with others, something my training did not adequately prepare me for, and something I have found, since joining Naruto's unit, that I am capable of, in ways I had not previously believed possible. The room went very still. I see, Danzo said finally, his voice giving away nothing at all. You believe yourself changed then, transformed by a few weeks in the company of sentimental children who have not yet learned the hard lessons this world insists on teaching, sooner or later, to everyone naive enough to believe otherwise. Perhaps, Sai said carefully. Or perhaps I have simply been given, for the first time, the opportunity to discover what I might have become, had circumstances been different. Danzo studied him for a long, silent moment, and Sai found himself unable to read anything at all behind that single, weathered, calculating eye. No anger, no visible disappointment, nothing but cold, patient assessment, the same expression Sai remembered from countless training sessions throughout his childhood. The look of a man carefully recalculating a strategy rather than reacting emotionally to an unexpected variable. Very well, Danzo said finally, leaning back into the shadows beyond the candle's small circle of light. You may continue your association with this unit, for the time being. I have no wish to force a confrontation that would draw unwanted attention during a period when the Council already scrutinizes my every action following recent events. Sai felt a brief, cautious flicker of relief, immediately tempered by the certainty that Danzo's easy acquiescence could not possibly be as simple as it sounded. But understand this, Sai, Danzo continued, his voice dropping lower, colder, carrying an edge of quiet, absolute conviction that made the temperature in the room feel as though it had dropped several degrees. The conditioning that shaped you across your entire life does not simply vanish because a boy with more heart than strategic sense has offered you kind words and the illusion of belonging. Sentiment is a luxury this world affords only to those who have never truly needed to rely on anything else. Should the day come, and it will come, Sai, sooner than you likely believe, when your new friend's sentimentality proves inadequate to protect them, when the hard choices this village genuinely requires reveal themselves in ways that pretty words about bonds and connection cannot resolve, I trust your training will reassert itself precisely when it matters most. He paused, letting the words settle, before adding, almost gently, in a tone all the more unsettling for its quiet certainty, I am, after all, a patient man. I am content to wait and see which lessons prove more durable in the end, mine or theirs. Sai said nothing, unable to find words adequate to the cold, creeping dread settling into his chest, the sense that he had just survived an encounter that had cost him something he couldn't fully name, even as he technically won the only concession that mattered. You may go, Danzo said finally, turning his attention back to the papers on his desk with dismissive finality, as though the conversation had never carried the weight it so clearly had. Sai bowed, formally, out of long habit, and made his way back up through the quiet, winding passages toward the surface, emerging finally into the cool evening air of a village he'd once believed himself to have no genuine stake in beyond his assigned function. He found himself, without quite deciding to, walking not toward his own small, sparse apartment, but toward the training ground where the squad had spent the afternoon, some part of him needing, urgently, the quiet reassurance of familiar, trusted presence after an encounter that had left him feeling more unsettled than he had in longer than he could remember. Danzo let him go. Just like that, no real resistance at all. And if you've been paying attention to how this man operates, you already know, that's not mercy. That's patience. And patience, from someone like Danzo, might be the single most dangerous thing this squad is about to face. Sai didn't sleep that night. He sat instead at the small, sparse table in his apartment, a blank canvas propped in front of him, brush loaded with ink he never actually touched to the paper. He had painted, over the past several weeks, dozens of small studies, landscapes, the squad together, a rough sketch of Hinata's Byakugan technique he'd found aesthetically interesting enough to document. Tonight, though, no image would come. His mind kept circling back to the same handful of sentences, replaying them with the same cold, precise clarity he'd once reserved for memorizing mission parameters. Should the day come when your new friend's sentimentality proves inadequate to protect them, I trust your training will reassert itself precisely when it matters most. He turned the words over and over, examining them from every angle he could think of, the way he'd been trained to examine any piece of intelligence for hidden meaning. Danzo rarely said anything without at least 2 layers of purpose behind it. On the surface, a warning, a prediction, an assertion of continued authority even in apparent concession. But underneath that, what was the actual function of the statement? Was it simply meant to unsettle him, to plant a seed of doubt that would fester quietly until it compromised his judgment at some critical future moment? Or was it something more direct, a signal that Danzo already had some specific plan in motion, something Sai was meant to anticipate, or perhaps even unknowingly assist? You have spent years training to read intent behind words. Now use that training on the man who taught it to you. He didn't reach any satisfying conclusion before the sky outside his window began, faintly, to lighten toward dawn. But one thing had crystallized clearly enough in his mind by the time the sun finally rose: he needed to tell Naruto. All of it. Not a careful, sanitized version designed to avoid worrying anyone. Everything. He found Naruto at Ichiraku's, unsurprisingly, hunched over a bowl of miso ramen with the particular focused intensity he brought to very few things besides eating and fighting. Sigh, Naruto said, brightening immediately, gesturing to the empty stool beside him. You're up early. Want some? Danzo summoned me last night, Sai said, without preamble, settling onto the stool but making no move toward the menu. I need to tell you what was discussed. Naruto's chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth, his expression shifting instantly from casual warmth to sharp, focused attention. He set the chopsticks down carefully, all traces of his earlier easy mood gone. Tell me everything, he said quietly. Sai did. The summons, the underground room, the conversation laid out precisely, word for word as best he could reconstruct it, including the parts that had cost him something internally to repeat aloud. Naruto listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening progressively throughout the recounting, his hands curling slowly into fists on the counter. He let you go, Naruto said finally, once Sai had finished. Just like that. No real fight. That is what concerns me most, Sai admitted. Danzo does not simply concede ground without reason. I have spent the night attempting to understand what benefit he gains from allowing my continued association with this unit. I have not reached a satisfying answer. You know that feeling when someone lets you win an argument way too easily? Yeah. Sai's instincts on this one are dead right, and Naruto knows it too. Maybe he just doesn't want the fight right now, Naruto said slowly, though he didn't sound convinced even as he said it. Bachan said the council's watching him close after everything with pain. Maybe pushing hard on this would draw more attention than it's worth to him. That is possible, Sai said. But I do not believe it is the complete picture. Danzo-sama does not typically retreat from a position simply because the immediate cost outweighs the immediate benefit. He calculates across much longer time frames than that. If he has decided to permit my continued presence here, I believe it is because he sees some future value in it, either as a source of information, or as something else I have not yet identified. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his half-finished ramen, the steam rising lazily between them. You think he's using you, Naruto said finally. It wasn't quite a question. I think, Sai said carefully, that it would be foolish to assume otherwise, regardless of how genuinely I believe my own choice to remain here to be my own. Danzo-sama did not build root by underestimating the value of patience. If he is willing to wait, it is because he believes waiting serves him better than acting now. Naruto exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the gesture of someone trying to physically shake loose a headache that wasn't going away anytime soon. Okay, he said finally. Then we go into this eyes open. We already knew Danzo wasn't going to just sit back and let us build this thing without pushing back somehow. This is the first real sign of what that pushback actually looks like. He looked up, meeting Sai's eyes directly. You did the right thing telling me this. All of it. I know that probably wasn't easy. Sai considered this for a moment. It was not, he admitted. Root conditioning does not encourage voluntary disclosure of information that might be perceived as compromising. There was a part of me, a significant part, that wanted to simply say nothing at all, to handle whatever Danzo-sama's intentions turn out to be entirely on my own. The way I have been trained to handle difficult situations my entire life. But you didn't, Naruto said. No, Sai agreed, and something almost like a genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. I did not. I am attempting to understand what it means to trust the people around me with information, rather than simply processing it alone. It is a difficult adjustment. But I believe, ultimately, the correct one. Naruto reached over and clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture warm and genuine in a way that made something in Sai's chest loosen slightly, some of the tight, anxious calculation from the sleepless night finally easing. For what it's worth, Naruto said, I'm glad you're here. Whatever Danzo's actually planning, we'll figure it out together. That's kind of the whole point of this team, right? Nobody handling the hard stuff alone. Naruto brought the news to the rest of the team that afternoon, gathering everyone at the training ground Yamato had claimed as their unofficial headquarters. He watched their reactions carefully as he relayed what Sai had told him, Shikamaru's expression sharpening into focus, calculating concern, Hinata's brow furrowing with quiet worry, Yamato going very still in the particular way that Naruto had learned meant he was drawing on old, difficult memories. That tracks with what I know of how Danzo operates, Yamato said finally, once Naruto had finished. I served adjacent to route operations for years before my reassignment to Team 7. He does not waste resources. If he's permitted Sai to remain with us, it's because he's calculated some value in it that outweighs whatever value he'd gain from forcing a direct confrontation right now. What kind of value, though? Shikamaru asked, frowning. Information, obviously. Sai could theoretically report back on our activities, though I doubt he would, given everything he just told Naruto. But is there something else? Some other angle we're not seeing? I do not know, Sai said quietly. I have considered this extensively, and have not reached a conclusion I am confident in. Could it be simpler than we're making it? Hinata offered, tentative but steady. Maybe he genuinely believes what he said, that Sai's training will reassert itself eventually, under enough pressure. Maybe he's not planning anything specific right now. Maybe he's just waiting to see if he's right. The group considered this for a moment, the quiet, uncomfortable possibility that Danzo's real strategy might simply be patience itself, a bet placed on the assumption that Root's conditioning ran deeper than whatever bonds Sai had formed with the rest of them. That's almost worse, Naruto said finally, quietly. Because it means there's no specific plan to counter. Just time. And whatever pressure he decides to apply eventually to test whether he's right. Then we make sure he's wrong, Shikamaru said, with a flat, quiet certainty that surprised even him, apparently, given the slight widening of his own eyes at his own words. Sorry, that came out more dramatic than I meant it. But it's true. If Danzo's whole strategy hinges on believing Sai's connection to this team is temporary, superficial, something that'll collapse under enough pressure, the answer isn't to panic about it. It's just to keep being exactly what we've been building. A team that actually means something to each other. Eventually either that holds up under pressure or it doesn't, and either way, worrying about it constantly isn't going to change the outcome. Sai looked at Shikamaru for a long moment, something complicated and grateful flickering behind his careful expression. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me, it's just logic, Shikamaru said, though the slight flush creeping up his neck suggested he was more affected by the moment than he wanted to let on. You know, for a team that started out barely able to coordinate a blindfolded obstacle course, these 5 have come a long way in a pretty short amount of time. But Danzo's just made his move, quiet as it was, and this squad's about to find out that patience cuts both ways. Tsunade summoned them 2 days later, and the mission briefing that followed made it immediately clear that whatever brief window of relative calm the team had enjoyed following their return from the bandit compound was well and truly over. We've received reports of unusual activity near the northern border, Tsunade said, gesturing toward a map pinned to the wall of her temporary office. Red markers clustered around a stretch of territory close to the boundary between Fire Country and the neighboring lands. Several villages in the area have reported disappearances over the past 2 weeks. Isolated at first, easy to dismiss as unrelated incidents, but the patterns become too consistent to ignore. Farmers, traveling merchants, a couple of off-duty chunin passing through the area on leave. All gone without a trace, no bodies recovered, no ransom demands, nothing. You think it's connected to what we found at the bandit compound, Naruto said, the pieces already clicking together in his mind. I don't know yet, Tsunade admitted. That's exactly the problem. It could be entirely unrelated. Bandits, a rival village's covert operation, something mundane we're overthinking because of what happened last time. Or it could be connected to whatever's actually behind that seal you found. I want your team to investigate directly. Discreetly. Find out what's actually happening out there before we commit any larger resources to it. Shikamaru studied the map carefully, tracing the pattern of red markers with a thoughtful frown. These disappearances. They're clustered pretty tightly along this stretch of border territory. That's a relatively contained search area, which is good. But if there's some kind of organized operation causing this, contained also means concentrated, which could mean whoever's responsible has more resources focused in a smaller area than we might expect. That's my read on it too, Tsunade said grimly. Which is exactly why I want this handled by a team capable of actual discretion, rather than sending in a larger, more obvious force that might spook whoever's responsible before we understand what we're actually dealing with. She looked around at the five of them. You leave at dawn tomorrow. I want regular reports back via Messenger Hawk. Yamato, you know the standard protocols for that. And I want to be very clear. If this does turn out to be connected to what you found before, your priority is information gathering, not direct confrontation. Am I understood? Understood, the team confirmed, though Naruto noticed a certain grim tension settling over the group as they filed out of the office. The unspoken awareness that this mission was likely to prove considerably more complicated than a simple investigation of missing persons. If you've been paying attention to this series so far, you already know that simple investigation is basically never how these missions actually turn out. And this one's about to prove that rule true in a way none of them are quite prepared for. They departed before dawn the next morning, moving swiftly through the forest toward the northern border territory. The mood among the group noticeably more focused and serious than it had been during their first mission together weeks earlier. Whatever awkward gaps in coordination had plagued that first outing had largely smoothed over during the intervening weeks of deliberate, dedicated training. The team moved now with an easy, practiced synchronization that made Naruto's chest swell with quiet pride every time he noticed it. They reached the border region by early afternoon, making contact first with the small farming village closest to the cluster of reported disappearances, a modest collection of homes and fields nestled against the tree line, the kind of unremarkable place that rarely drew Shinobi attention except when something had gone seriously wrong. The village elder, an elderly man named Burrow with a weathered, worried face, met them at the edge of the settlement, his relief at seeing Konoha Shinobi visible even through his obvious exhaustion. 6 of our people now, he said, once they'd explained their purpose. Started with old Kenji, gone out to check his fields one morning and never came back. Then a merchant passing through, then 2 more villagers, then, he shook his head grimly. We stopped letting anyone travel alone after the 3rd disappearance. Doesn't seem to have mattered much. The last one vanished from inside his own home, if you can believe that. Door locked from the inside, no sign of a struggle. Just gone. No sign of struggle at all? Shikamaru asked sharply, exchanging a quick glance with Yamato. None, Burrow confirmed. It's like they just evaporated. My grandson's convinced it's spirits. But I've lived long enough to know that's rarely the real explanation for things like this. Has anyone reported seeing anything unusual in the area? Naruto asked. Strange lights, unfamiliar people passing through, anything out of the ordinary? Burrow considered this for a moment. There was talk, a few weeks back, of lights out in the old ruins to the east, abandoned outpost from before my grandfather's time, used to be some kind of research station, or so the old stories say. Most folks around here avoid the place entirely, always have, long before any of this started. But young Taro swore he saw movement out there one night. Nobody believed him at the time. Given everything since though, we'll investigate, Naruto said firmly. Thank you for your help. The old research station, once they located it with Hinata Byakugan guiding them through the dense forest terrain, proved to be considerably more intact than its reputation as ancient, abandoned ruins had suggested. Half-collapsed structures, yes, and thick overgrowth choking most of the visible buildings. But beneath the neglected surface, Hinata's expanded vision revealed something that made her go very still, her expression shifting rapidly from casual scanning to sharp, focused alarm. "There's activity below ground," she reported quietly, once the team had gathered around her at a safe distance from the ruins. "A substantial underground structure, considerably more extensive than what's visible on the surface. I count 8 individuals currently active within it, though the layout makes it difficult to be entirely certain given the depth, and the way some of the chambers seem shielded from my vision." "Shielded how?" Shikamaru asked immediately. "I'm not certain," Hinata admitted, frowning slightly with the effort of trying to parse what she was seeing. "There are sections that seem to actively resist my Byakugan's penetration, similar to certain chakra suppression seals I've encountered in Hyuga clan training, but more sophisticated than anything I've personally studied before." Yamato's expression had gone carefully neutral in the particular way Naruto had learned to associate with old, uncomfortable memories surfacing. "That kind of shielding," he said slowly, "is consistent with certain research protocols I encountered during my own time as one of Orochimaru's experimental subjects, before my eventual reassignment to Konoha's service. If this facility is using similar methodology..." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and Naruto watched something old and painful pass behind his usually steady, controlled expression. "You think this could be connected to Orochimaru's old experiments?" Naruto asked carefully. "I don't know," Yamato admitted. "It's possible. Orochimaru operated numerous facilities throughout Fire Country and beyond during his time in Konoha, many of which were never fully located or shut down after his defection. It's equally possible this is something entirely separate, a different organization employing similar methodology, whether through direct connection to his old research or simple convergent development. Either way," Shikamaru said grimly, 8 people disappearing without a trace, an underground facility with sophisticated chakra shielding technology, located conveniently close to a stretch of border territory where a group with an authentic-looking Konoha administrative seal was recently caught stealing sensitive scrolls. I don't love how many dots are lining up here. You know that moment in a story where all the separate, seemingly unrelated threads suddenly start looking like they might be the same thread after all? Yeah, this squad just hit exactly that moment, and it is not a comfortable realization. "We need more information before we do anything else," Naruto said, forcing himself to think tactically rather than react on pure instinct, the way Shikamaru's training over the past weeks had gradually taught him to do. Tsunade said, "Gather intelligence, not engage directly." "Sai, can you get an ink construct down there without triggering whatever's shielding the deeper chambers?" Sai considered this, already reaching for a blank scroll. "I can attempt a construct small enough and constructed of sufficiently inert chakra signature to avoid immediate detection. I cannot guarantee it will penetrate the more heavily shielded sections Hinata-san described, but it should provide a clearer picture of the facility's general layout and the individuals currently present." "Do it," Naruto said. Carefully, Sai worked quickly and quietly, brush moving across the scroll in small, precise strokes, bringing to life a tiny ink mouse that scurried silently off toward the overgrown entrance Hinata had identified, disappearing into a crack in the collapsed stonework barely wide enough to admit it. They waited in tense silence for nearly 10 minutes before the small construct returned, dissolving back into Sai's awareness with the information it had gathered. Sai's expression, when the information finished transferring, went carefully, deliberately blank in a way that immediately alarmed the rest of the team. "Sai," Naruto prompted. "What did you see?" "Cells," Sai said quietly. "Underground holding cells, several of them occupied. I was able to confirm at least 4 individuals matching descriptions consistent with the village's reported disappearances, restrained but apparently alive. There is also what appears to be a laboratory space, containing equipment I do not fully recognize, though several elements bear resemblance to research documentation I encountered during my route training regarding forbidden chakra experimentation techniques." The team absorbed this information in grim, heavy silence. "They're alive?" Hinata said finally, quietly, something fierce and determined settling into her usually gentle expression. "That means we still have time. We need to move carefully," Shikamaru said, already turning the problem over rapidly in his mind. "If this facility is running experiments similar to what Orochimaru used to conduct, or something even more dangerous, we're not just talking about a rescue mission anymore. We're talking about potentially disrupting research that could be extremely dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands, or if whoever's running this facility panics and destroys evidence, or worse, the captives themselves, the moment they realize we're here. So what's the plan? Naruto asked, forcing his voice to stay level despite the urgency building in his chest at the thought of innocent villagers held captive underground, subjected to whatever twisted research this facility was conducting. Shikamaru was quiet for a long moment, studying the rough layout Sai had gathered, his sharp mind working rapidly through possibilities. We need a two-pronged approach, he said finally. Sai, Hinata, you two continue gathering intelligence on the facility's layout and the number of hostiles present, staying as far from detection as possible. I want to know exactly how many people we're dealing with and exactly where those cells are located before we commit to anything. Yamato, Naruto, and I will scout the surface perimeter for additional entry points and any external security measures we might have missed. And once we have that information? Yamato asked. Then we plan an extraction, Shikamaru said grimly. Get those captives out safely, gather whatever evidence we can about what's actually happening down there, and get back to Tsunade-sama with enough concrete information that she can authorize whatever larger response this situation actually requires. This isn't something 5 shinobi should try to handle entirely on our own, not if it's even half as significant as it's starting to look. The reconnaissance took the better part of the afternoon, the team moving with careful, practiced stealth around the ruins' perimeter, gradually building a more complete picture of the facility's layout, its defenses, and the disturbing scope of what appeared to be happening within it. It was during this careful surveillance that Hinata's Byakugan finally caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A figure emerging briefly from one of the facility's more heavily shielded chambers, visible for only a few seconds before disappearing back into the sections her vision couldn't fully penetrate. A figure wearing a distinctive black cloak patterned with red clouds. Akatsuki, she breathed, her voice barely audible even to the rest of the team clustered nearby. The word landed among them like a physical blow. You're certain? Naruto asked, his voice tight. I only saw them for a moment, Hinata admitted, but the cloak pattern was unmistakable. Red clouds against black fabric. I've seen the description in intelligence briefings enough times to recognize it immediately. Shikamaru's jaw tightened, his mind visibly racing through the implications. That changes everything. If Akatsuki's actually involved in this facility, this isn't just some rogue research operation or a root offshoot experimenting independently. This could be direct evidence of exactly the kind of threat this squad was originally created to handle. And there it is. The moment this mission stops being about missing villagers and starts being about something considerably bigger. If you've been wondering when this what-if story was finally going to bring Akatsuki directly into the picture, well, here we are. We need to get word back to Tsunade-sama immediately, Yamato said, already reaching for the small message capsule he carried for exactly this kind of situation. This is well beyond what our charter authorizes us to handle independently. If Akatsuki has an active presence at this facility, we need proper backup before attempting anything further. Agreed, Naruto said, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to act immediately, to charge in and free the captives before whatever experiments were happening to them could continue any longer. He thought of the crater back in Konoha, of Jiraiya's death, of everything Akatsuki had already cost this village and the people he cared about, and forced himself, with considerable effort, to hold that instinct in check. Yamato quickly composed a brief, coded message summarizing their findings and sent it off via a small messenger hawk he'd brought along specifically for this purpose, watching as the bird disappeared into the darkening evening sky, winging its way back toward Konoha. Now what? Naruto asked, once the hawk had vanished from sight. Now, Shikamaru said grimly, we wait for a response, while continuing to monitor the situation as carefully as possible. If those captives are in immediate danger, we may not have the luxury of waiting for a full response team to arrive. But going in now, without adequate information or backup, against a facility that potentially includes an Akatsuki member, would be reckless in the extreme. They settled into a careful, rotating watch as evening deepened into full night, the ruins below them betraying no outward sign of the disturbing activity Hinata's Byakugan and Sai's ink constructs had revealed taking place beneath the overgrown surface. Naruto found himself, during his portion of the watch rotation, sitting quietly beside Hinata, both of them staring down at the dark, unassuming ruins with the particular tense stillness of people waiting for something they both suspected was coming regardless of how carefully they prepared for it. You're worried, Hinata observed quietly, not quite a question. Yeah, Naruto admitted, seeing no point in denying it. Akatsuki? Right here, close enough that we could probably reach it in minutes if we decided to move. Feels like exactly the kind of thing I built this team to actually handle, and also exactly the kind of thing I'm terrified we're not actually ready for yet. Hinata was quiet for a moment, considering this. I think, she said finally, carefully, that readiness isn't really a fixed thing you either have or don't have. I think it's something you build in the moment, with the people around you, using whatever training and trust you've managed to establish beforehand. We've built a lot of that these past few weeks, more than I think any of us fully realized until a moment like this actually tested it. Naruto looked at her for a long moment in the dim starlight, something warm and steady settling in his chest despite the tension of the situation. When did you get so wise? He asked, a small, genuine smile touching his mouth despite everything. Hinata's answering smile was equally genuine, equally warm. I've always been like this, Naruto-kun. You've just started actually noticing, is all. Alright, I promised you these two would keep circling each other, and here we are again. But don't get too comfortable with the quiet moment, because things are about to get very loud, very fast. The response from Tsunade arrived just before midnight. A coded message carried by a second messenger hawk, brief but urgent in its instructions, confirmed intelligence critical. Backup team dispatched, ETA 6 hours. Maintain surveillance only. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage until backup arrives. Shikamaru read the message twice, then passed it silently around the group, each of them absorbing the clear, unambiguous instruction with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. 6 hours, Naruto said, glancing back down toward the dark, quiet ruins below them. That's a long time to just sit here and watch, knowing there are people trapped down there. It's the right call, Shikamaru said firmly. We don't have nearly enough information about what we're actually facing to attempt a rescue against potential Akatsuki-level opposition with just the 5 of us. Reckless heroics get people killed, Naruto. You know that as well as anyone at this point. Naruto nodded reluctantly, forcing himself to accept the wisdom of it even as every protective instinct in his body continued to strain against the enforced patience. They settled back into their careful surveillance rotation, the hours crawling by with agonizing slowness as the moon tracked its way across the star-filled sky above the silent ruins. It was sometime past 3 in the morning, during Sai's watch rotation, that everything changed. Movement, Sai reported quietly, his ink construct's awareness flowing back to him in a sudden, urgent rush. Multiple individuals emerging from the facility's main entrance. They appeared to be, he paused, his expression tightening with something close to alarm. They appeared to be moving the captives, transporting them somewhere else. The team snapped instantly to full alertness, gathering quickly at the ridge overlooking the ruins. If they're moving the captives, Yamato said grimly, it likely means they've detected our surveillance, or at minimum decided to relocate before our backup arrives, for reasons we may not fully understand yet. We can't just let them disappear those people to some new location we don't know about, Naruto said, his voice tight with barely restrained urgency. If they move now, we could lose the trail completely, and those villagers. I know, Shikamaru cut in, his own voice carrying an edge of genuine strain despite his usual measured calm. I know, Naruto. But engaging now, against unknown numbers, potentially including an actual Akatsuki member, without backup. Below them in the darkness, the first of the captives were being led out of the facility's entrance, bound and clearly disoriented, flanked by figures in dark clothing that Hinata's Byakugan confirmed included at least 2 wearing the unmistakable black and red cloak pattern. 2 Akatsuki members. Confirmed. And a squad that was explicitly ordered not to engage, watching helplessly as the very people they came to save get marched away right in front of them. Shikamaru, Naruto said, his voice low and urgent, if we don't do something right now, those people disappear. Maybe for good. You know that as well as I do. Shikamaru's jaw worked silently for a long, agonized moment, torn between the explicit orders from Tsunade and the very real, immediate crisis unfolding below them. The exact kind of impossible tactical calculation that Asuma's old lessons about protecting what mattered most had never quite prepared him to make with actual lives, hanging in the balance, and no clean answer available. Everyone stay absolutely silent and follow my lead, he said finally, his voice tight with decision. We are not engaging directly, but we are not letting them disappear those captives without at least attempting to track exactly where they're being taken. Sai, get eyes in the air, as high and as far back as you can manage without detection. Hinata, maintain Byakugan tracking on their formation. The rest of us move to shadow their route from a distance, staying completely out of engagement range unless there's absolutely no other choice. And if there is no other choice? Yamato asked quietly. Shikamaru's expression, in the pale moonlight, was grimmer than Naruto had ever seen it. Then we do whatever we have to do to keep those people alive, he said. And we deal with the consequences of disobeying orders afterward, assuming we're all still around to face them. Below them, the procession of captives and their captors began moving out from the ruins, disappearing into the dense tree line heading east, away from Konoha, away from any backup that might arrive in the coming hours, into terrain and a destination entirely unknown. Naruto felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the team began moving to follow, every one of them acutely aware that whatever careful, measured planning had gotten them this far was about to be tested against exactly the kind of impossible, high-stakes situation this entire unit had been created to handle, 6 hours too early, with backups still far out of reach, and 2 confirmed Akatsuki members standing between them and the people they'd sworn to protect. And that's where we're going to